The first thing I remember about my wedding reception is not the music or the flowers or even Adam standing beside me with his hand warm against the small of my back. I remember 2 round tables near the windows, each set for 8, every ivory place card still perfectly upright. My mother's name, my father's, my sister Brittany's. Aunts, cousins, people who had spent my entire childhood insisting that family showed up for family. Every chair was empty. When the photographer quietly asked whether I wanted the tables moved before we cut the cake, I looked at them for one more second and said, "No, just shoot toward the windows." I was not going to rearrange my wedding to make their absence look prettier. An hour later, while Adam and I were still smiling for guests who had actually bothered to come, my phone buzzed. My cousin Megan had sent me a photograph from Brittany's engagement party. My sister was standing beneath a wall of white roses, smiling beside her fiancé, Ryan. Around her neck was my grandmother Evelyn's bridal necklace, the one she had left to me for my wedding day. And behind Brittany, in gold letters large enough to read even on my phone screen, were 4 words I had never seen before. The Evelyn Legacy Collection. Before I tell you what happened after that photograph reached me, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because what I thought was a family choosing my sister over me turned out to be something much bigger and much more calculated. And if you enjoy stories about families who discover too late that the person they underestimated was paying attention, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happened next. By the time I saw Megan's message, I had already spent most of the day proving something to myself. I had not begged anyone to come. My wedding date had been booked for months. The venue was a restored 19th century building in Savannah, with tall windows, weathered brick, and a courtyard Adam had fallen in love with before we had even finished the tour. We planned for early November because Savannah was usually mild then, cool enough for an outdoor cocktail hour, without turning our guests into puddles in formal clothes. By the beginning of October, our invitations had been mailed, vendors confirmed, deposits paid, travel booked, and my dress was hanging in a garment bag in my studio, where I could inspect every seam like the textile conservator I was. 2 weeks after those invitations went out, Brittany announced her engagement party. Same day. When my mother called to tell me, she used the tone she reserved for situations she had already decided were reasonable. "Helen Price is going to be in Savannah that weekend," Patricia said. "This is the only chance we have to get her in the room." Helen was a regional merchandising director whose company supplied several bridal boutiques across the Southeast. I knew the name because Davis Bridal House had been trying to expand its wholesale accounts for years. I also knew Helen Price had absolutely nothing to do with whether my younger sister needed to celebrate her engagement on my wedding day. "So have dinner with her," I said. "It isn't that simple." "It sounds extremely simple." My mother exhaled. "Brittany's engagement gives us a reason to bring everyone together naturally. Helen wants to understand the family behind the brand." I remember standing in my studio with a half-restored 1950s lace bodice spread across my work table, staring at one tiny broken thread as though it might explain my mother to me. "You want to turn Brittany's engagement party into a business event. I want to give the company a fighting chance. And it has to happen during my wedding. You chose your date months ago, Lauren. Nobody is asking you to change it." That line stayed with me. Nobody is asking you to change it. It sounded almost respectful until you understood what she meant. My wedding could continue exactly as planned. My family simply would not be there. Over the following days, relatives began calling. An aunt told me the company employed people she had known for 20 years. A cousin said his brother-in-law worked in shipping. Megan sounded embarrassed when she told me her husband's hours at the warehouse had already been cut twice that fall. Nobody said, "We choose Brittany." They said, "You understand, don't you?" They said, "It's business." They said, "You'll have Adam." They said, "You have plenty of friends coming." They said, "This could affect people's jobs." I stopped arguing after the 4th conversation. That was a habit of mine. One my family understood better than I did at the time. When an argument became circular, I left it. I had left Davis Bridal House 6 years earlier for the same reason. I had spent enough years listening to my mother turn every disagreement into a referendum on loyalty. When I built my own conservation and restoration studio, I discovered a world where evidence mattered more than volume. Fabric fibers did not guilt you. Provenance records did not accuse you of being ungrateful. Either a repair had been documented or it had not. Either an object belonged in a collection or it did not. So when my family made their decision about my wedding, I made mine. I would not move the date. I would not ask them again. And on November 8th, I married Adam without them. That does not mean it did not hurt. There was a particular kind of silence around those empty tables. Guests noticed them, even when they tried not to. People would look toward the windows, then quickly back at me. My closest friend, Emily, had rearranged the seating so the emptiness did not break up groups of guests. But she had refused to remove the place cards unless I asked. I never did. Adam noticed every time my eyes drifted that direction. "You want 5 minutes?" he asked me quietly after dinner. We were standing near the bar, while the band reset between songs. He had loosened his tie slightly, and someone had already stolen the boutonniere from his jacket to preserve it before he crushed it dancing. For what? To be angry, sad, whatever you need. I looked across the room. My friends were laughing. Adam's mother was talking to my old college roommate as if they had known each other for years. 2 of my clients had driven nearly 4 hours. Denise Harper, who had spent decades sewing beside my grandmother, had come despite insisting she did not do weddings anymore. Then I looked at the empty tables. "No," I said. "I'm not making the people who came pay for the people who didn't." Adam studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Dance?" "Definitely." So I danced. Not because I had stopped caring. Because refusing to let someone ruin something is not the same as pretending they did not hurt you. We cut the cake a little after 8. The photographer positioned us beneath hanging lights in front of the tall windows. I could see reflections of the empty tables in the glass if I looked hard enough, so I didn't. Adam put too much cake on my fork. "You're going to get frosting on my dress. You literally restore wedding dresses for a living." "I restore other people's mistakes." "Excellent. Then you're qualified." I laughed. A real laugh. That was when my phone buzzed in the small satin purse Emily had handed back to me. I almost ignored it. Then I saw Megan's name. She had sent only 1 sentence. "I thought you should know." The photograph loaded underneath. For a few seconds, I did not understand what I was seeing. Brittany stood beneath a floral wall, wearing an ivory cocktail dress. Her hand rested against Ryan's chest. Her engagement ring angled perfectly toward the photographer. Behind them were tall arrangements, a champagne tower, and 3 mannequins, dressed in unfinished bridal gowns. The event looked considerably more expensive than the small family engagement celebration my mother had described. But none of that held my attention. The necklace did. Grandma Evelyn's necklace was not spectacular in the way expensive jewelry often tries to be spectacular. It was a double strand of old pearls with a white gold floral clasp, small diamonds set into 5 petals around the center. I knew that clasp. When I was 16, Grandma had discovered one of the tiny hinges was loose. She took me to the jeweler with her because she said anyone who loved old things needed to understand that preservation began before something broke completely. The jeweler removed the necklace and placed it on black velvet. Grandma watched me stare at it. "Try it," she said. "I'll break it." "Then don't." That was Grandma. I fastened it around my neck while she watched from the mirror. For one ridiculous second, 16-year-old me had imagined myself in a wedding dress. Grandma smiled. "Someday," she said. "But not with that sweatshirt." Years later, when her estate documents were updated, the necklace was specifically left to me. Not because it was the most valuable thing she owned. Because we both remembered that afternoon. I touched my bare collarbone instinctively as I stared at Brittany wearing it on the night of my wedding. Emily came closer. "What happened?" I turned the phone face down. "Give me a minute." I walked into the hallway outside the ballroom, where the band became a distant thump behind heavy doors. My pulse was suddenly too loud. For one brief, ugly moment, I wanted to call Brittany. I wanted to hear her answer in that bright voice she used when she already knew she was winning. I wanted to ask whether she enjoyed wearing something Grandma had promised me, while our entire family toasted her engagement instead of watching me get married. Then training took over. Not emotional training, professional training. When I receive a damaged textile, I do not begin by deciding who ruined it. I document its condition. I opened Megan's message again and saved the photograph without editing it. Then I called Martin Cole. Martin had handled my grandmother's finances for years before becoming executor of her estate. He answered on the fourth ring. Lauren? Sorry. I know it's Saturday. And your wedding day. Apparently somebody remembered. I need you to check something. His voice changed immediately. What? Grandma's necklace. Has it been distributed? There was a pause. To you? To anyone? No. Are you sure? I inventoried it myself. Where is it? Another pause, longer this time. It should still be in the estate jewelry box in the atelier safe. The handoff was scheduled after we finished the final jewelry schedule and insurance paperwork. I stared at the ballroom doors. What jewelry box? The estate box, numbered seal. I photographed it when we inventoried the contents. I swallowed. I'm looking at Brittany wearing the necklace right now. Martin did not say anything for several seconds. Then he said very carefully, How are you looking at it? My cousin sent me a photograph from the engagement party. Did she send the original file? She texted it. Keep the message. Don't crop the photograph. Forward it to me exactly as you received it. That was why I liked Martin. No outrage. No ground declarations. Procedure first. Was Brittany authorized to use it? I asked. Not by me. Could my mother have authorized it? No. That answer landed harder than I expected. Even after everything that day, some part of me had wanted there to be an explanation. A paperwork mistake. A temporary loan. Something careless instead of deliberate. Martin continued. Lauren, do not confront anyone tonight. Enjoy your wedding. We can deal with this tomorrow. Martin. Yes? If the box was sealed, how did she get it? I don't know yet. I sent him the photograph. Then, because I had spent half my adult life enlarging images to inspect stitch patterns and fabric damage, I did what came naturally. I zoomed in. That was when the necklace stopped being the worst thing in the photograph. Behind Brittany and Ryan, gold lettering curved across the flower wall. The Evelyn Legacy Collection. I read it twice. Then I looked at the mannequins. There were 3 gowns visible clearly enough to study. One had lace sleeves. One had a fitted satin bodice. The third was turned partly sideways. Along its skirt ran a branch of embroidered dogwood blossoms. 3 buds clustered at the lower bend. 2 open flowers angled in opposite directions. One thin branch extended higher than the others. My finger froze against the screen. I knew that arrangement. Not vaguely. Exactly. Grandma had hundreds of motifs associated with Davis Bridal House. Some had appeared in catalogs for 30 years. Some belonged to the company. Some had been commissioned for specific collections. Others existed only in her private archive. The dogwood pattern in Megan's photograph belonged to the last group. Years before Grandma died, I had helped rehouse part of her personal archive because the old paper folders were becoming acidic. The dogwood drawing had been inside a sleeve marked E9. I remembered it because Grandma had drawn the flowers correctly. Most decorative dogwoods were stylized into symmetrical 4-petal shapes. Grandma had spent 15 minutes complaining that designers kept making them look like bathroom tiles. That branch had never been released. Never photographed for a catalog. Never used in a production gown. At least not while Grandma was alive. Someone opened the ballroom door behind me. Adam stepped into the hallway. He took one look at my face and stopped. What is it? I handed him my phone. He looked at the photograph. Your grandmother's necklace? Yes. He looked again. And something else. I pointed to the lettering. Then the gown. That embroidery came from Grandma's private archive. Could they have copied it from something old? No. You're sure? I appreciated that question more than he probably knew. Not, what did your mother do? Not, how could Brittany? Just, are you sure? I'm sure I've seen the original, I said. I'm not sure yet how they got it. Adam handed the phone back to me. What do you want to do? The hallway smelled faintly of champagne and flowers. Through the doors, I could hear our guests laughing as the band started another song. For most of my life, my family had been good at forcing every moment to revolve around whatever crisis they had created. Someone was offended. Someone needed help. Someone had made a decision everybody else was expected to accommodate. I looked at my husband. "Tomorrow," I said. Adam smiled slightly. "Tomorrow? Tomorrow I find out what they did. And tonight?" I opened the ballroom door. "Tonight I'm married." We went back inside. I did not tell our guests about the necklace. I did not tell them about the dresses. I did not stand on a chair and announce that my mother and sister had taken something from my grandmother's estate. I danced with Adam until my shoes hurt. I hugged the people who had come. I ate another slice of cake after midnight because the first one had disappeared before I got more than 2 bites. For several hours, I refused to investigate my own family. That decision mattered later. Because the next morning, when I finally opened my laptop in the hotel room and sent Megan's photograph to Denise Harper, I was no longer a bride looking at an insult. I was a conservator looking at provenance. Denise called me less than 10 minutes later. She did not say hello. "Lauren, where did you get that picture?" "My cousin." "Was that taken last night?" "Yes." I sat straighter. "Why?" There was a silence on her end. Then Denise said, "That dogwood pattern wasn't taken from an old Davis catalog." "I know." "No," she said. "You don't understand." Her voice had changed. Denise had spent almost 30 years working beside my grandmother. I had heard her irritated, exhausted, amused, and once so furious over a ruined bolt of French lace that she refused to speak to a supplier for 6 months. I had never heard her sound frightened. "Evelyn never released that design," she said. "It was still in the private E-series when I stopped working there." I looked toward Adam, who was standing by the hotel window with 2 cups of coffee. Denise continued, "If they used that pattern on a prototype, somebody didn't find it in an old catalog." I already knew what she was going to say. Still, hearing it made my stomach tighten. Somebody got into Evelyn's private folders. By the time Denise finished speaking, the coffee Adam had handed me was already cooling between my palms. "Are you certain?" I asked. "I worked from those folders for years," she said. "The public catalog files were labeled differently. Evelyn kept the E-series separate because some of those motifs were experiments, some were personal work, and some she simply never approved for commercial use." I looked again at Megan's photograph on my laptop screen. The dogwood embroidery seemed almost harmless from a distance. 5 flowers. A curved branch. Nothing dramatic enough to explain why my chest had tightened when I saw it. But provenance rarely looks dramatic. A forged signature can be 6 millimeters long. A missing accession number can change ownership. A small stain in the corner of a drawing can tell you whether you are looking at the original or a copy. "Did anyone ask you to work on that pattern recently?" I asked. Denise went quiet. That silence answered before she did. "A few weeks ago," she said, "Patricia asked if I could help with prototype finishing. I thought it was regular freelance work." I put the coffee down. "What did she send you?" "PDFs. 4, maybe 5, I'd have to check." "Do you still have them?" "Yes." "What were the file names?" Another pause. Enon was one of them. Adam had been standing by the window, giving me privacy without pretending not to listen. When I looked at him, he could tell immediately that the situation had changed. I turned back to Denise. "Please don't delete anything." "I won't. And don't call my mother." I wasn't planning to. That almost made me smile. Denise had known Patricia longer than I had been alive. She also knew that calling my mother before understanding the facts was the fastest way to make sure the facts disappeared under an argument. "I'll call you later," I said. When I hung up, Adam slid the coffee back toward me. "Drink. I need to call Martin." "You need to drink and call Martin." I obeyed both instructions. Martin answered quickly this time. I told him what Denise had said and asked him to send me whatever estate documents I was entitled to receive electronically. "There are 3 things you need," he said. "The inventory, the partial distribution instrument from September, and the rights schedule Evelyn signed with the company years ago." I stopped typing. "What rights schedule?" "Archive and creative rights schedule. 2018. I knew Grandma had spent years untangling what belonged to Davis Bridal House and what remained hers personally. But I had never paid much attention to the mechanics. When you grow up around a family business, Ownership becomes a kind of background noise. The building belongs to the company. The antique cutting table belonged to Grandma, then maybe the company, depending on who was telling the story. Old photographs were in drawers, sketches were in boxes, sample lace was everywhere. Half the family spoke about all of it, as if the word Davis made distinctions unnecessary. Apparently, Grandma had not trusted the word Davis quite that much. Martin continued. That schedule was created after the company started digitizing older materials. Evelyn wanted to avoid confusion between corporate assets and her private archive. And the E-series? Listed as personal property. My grip tightened around the pen. Physical property? Physical archive and any rights she had retained in the listed works. I'm going to let Claire explain the copyright side. Because that's not my field. Claire? Claire Benton, commercial and IP attorney. Evelyn consulted her once during the archive review. I think you should speak with her before you contact the company. I almost said I didn't need a lawyer yet. Then I remembered my sister wearing estate jewelry beneath a branded backdrop, while a private archival pattern hung behind her. Send me her number. Martin promised to email the documents within the hour. I closed the laptop. Adam looked surprised. That's it? For now. You're not calling anybody? No. He nodded slowly. Good. Don't sound so relieved. I married you yesterday. I'd like to spend at least 24 hours with my wife before your mother turns us into a deposition. That time I did laugh. Our original plan had been to drive to Charleston that morning, stay 2 nights, eat irresponsibly expensive food, walk until our feet hurt, and come home before I had to reopen my studio. It was not a grand honeymoon. We were saving the longer trip for spring. For about 5 minutes, I considered canceling. I could stay in Savannah, go straight to the atelier, demand access to the archive room, find my mother, find Brittany, stand in the middle of Davis Bridal House and ask why my grandmother's unpublished work had appeared at an engagement party on my wedding day. The fantasy was satisfying. It was also stupid. If documents mattered, showing everyone exactly what I was looking for before I had reviewed them would accomplish nothing except warn them. Adam was packing his overnight bag when I said, "We're going." "To Charleston?" "Yes." He zipped the bag. "I was hoping you'd say that. I'm setting rules." "Of course you are. 1 hour in the morning. I deal with this for 1 hour. Then the laptop closes. What if something urgent happens? Martin has my number. A real emergency can find me." Adam held out his hand. "Deal." We left Savannah a little after 10. The drive north took a little over 2 hours, longer once we hit traffic outside Charleston. I spent the first 40 minutes staring out the window and trying not to reconstruct my mother's decisions. That was another professional habit I had to fight. Conservators are trained to infer carefully. A stain can indicate water exposure. A broken thread can indicate stress. But indicate is not prove. I knew Patricia had access to the building. I knew the archive was still physically stored there. I knew she had sent Denise a file labeled E9. I did not yet know who had scanned it. I did not know whether some earlier permission existed. I did not know whether Davis Bridal House held rights I had never understood. And I absolutely did not know enough to accuse anyone of theft in writing. By the time we reached Charleston, Martin's email was waiting. So was a message from Claire Benton. "Martin told me you may need a short consultation. I can speak at 4. At 3:55, Adam ordered oysters at a restaurant near our hotel and told me he would not be offended if I took the call upstairs. You hate oysters. I know. Then why did you order them? So I have something to be angry about besides your family." I left him laughing at his own joke and went back to the room. Claire Benton appeared on my screen at exactly 4. She looked to be in her mid-40s, wore dark-framed glasses, and had the expression of someone who had spent years listening to clients describe complicated situations as simple. "I've reviewed Martin's summary," she said. "Before we talk strategy, I want to separate 3 things." She held up one finger. "Things the company owns. A second, things Evelyn owned and transferred through the estate. A third, things that may look similar but are not legally useful until we establish source and rights." I liked her immediately. "I have photographs," I said. "Good. Photographs are not conclusions. I know. Even better. She shared a document on screen. The title read, Archive and Creative Rights Schedule. The date was from 2018. Claire scrolled. This was signed by Evelyn and Davis Bridal House, Incorporated. It appears to have been created specifically because both sides were using materials stored in the same building. I read the categories. Company-owned catalogs. Company-commissioned photography. Production patterns. Historical advertising assets. Then another heading. E-Series Private Creative Archive. My grandmother's name appeared beside it. Claire said, according to this schedule, the E-Series remained Evelyn's personal property. More importantly, the agreement states that inclusion in the company's physical archive room did not transfer ownership. I leaned closer. So they can't say it became company property because it stayed there. They can say anything. Whether it works is another question. Claire scrolled again. Now the estate document. The September partial distribution instrument was less elegant. Dense legal language. References to schedules. Signatures. Claire highlighted one paragraph. This transferred the physical E-Series archive to you, along with the copyrights and licensing rights Evelyn still owned in the listed works. Before the wedding. Yes. So I own E9. Slow down. I sat back. Claire continued. You own the rights Evelyn owned in the listed E-Series works. That is different from owning every dress that may use a flower resembling a dogwood. We still need to establish that the prototype actually derived from a protected E-Series work, not from a company asset, a public domain source, or a separately created design. I nodded. That's fair. Also, fashion can get legally messy. I don't want the case built around the shape of a gown. I want source artwork, original illustrations, embroidery designs, files, dates, and documented use. That's my language. I know. Martin told me what you do. I looked down at the old photographs saved on my laptop. I may have something. Before Grandma died, I had spent several weekends helping her move fragile papers out of old folders and into archival sleeves. I had photographed almost everything before and after handling, because that was what I did with objects that mattered, not glamorous photographs. No flattering light, no careful composition, just documentation. Folder, code, condición, contents. My mother used to tease me about it. You take more pictures of boxes than people, she once said when I stopped Thanksgiving cleanup to photograph a damaged storage sleeve Grandma had found in the studio. At the time, I had rolled my eyes. Now I opened the folder in my cloud drive and silently thanked every annoying professional instinct I had ever developed. The images were organized by year, then collection, then code. I clicked through. Adri, Avir, Evaif. Claire waited without filling the silence. Azeven, Icht, then Inoin. There. I shared my screen. The photograph showed a cream archival sleeve with a handwritten label in Grandma's blocky script. Inside was the dogwood branch, 3 buds at the lower curve, 2 open blossoms facing away from each other, a narrow branch extending upward. Exactly what I had seen in Megan's photograph. But there was more. Near the lower right edge of the original drawing was a faint brown mark, almost like a thumbprint. I zoomed in. I remember that stain. Claire said, Why? Grandma spilled tea while we were rehousing this set. She blamed me. Was it you? No. You sound very certain. She drank tea. I drank coffee. Claire smiled for the first time. Then she became serious again. Send me the original photograph. Not a screenshot. I did. I also pulled up Megan's party photo and zoomed the prototype. The embroidery had been adapted slightly for scale, but the branch structure was unmistakable. Claire did not say we had won anything. She said, that is worth investigating, which was better. After the call, I kept searching. One folder caught my attention because it was not an archive sleeve. It was a charity event photograph from 2014. Brittany was 20 years old, standing backstage in one of Grandma's gowns. She looked almost absurdly comfortable under bright lights. Even in a still photograph, Brittany knew what to do with attention. Grandma stood beside her, one hand near the waist of the gown, as if she were checking the fit. I remembered the event vaguely. A local charity runway. Brittany had modeled. I had been busy in college and had not attended. I almost closed the image, then stopped. There was something irritating about how natural Brittany looked in the dress. That sounds petty, because it was. My sister had always been good at presentation. She could walk into a room and understand instantly where to stand, whom to greet, and how to make something look desirable. I had spent years treating that as superficial because it was not the thing I was good at. I did not recognize the importance of that thought yet. I just closed the photograph and went downstairs to find my husband. The next morning, I kept my 1-hour rule. At 8:15, Denise forwarded the prototype files Patricia had sent her. Claire had told me not to alter file names or metadata, so I downloaded everything into a new evidence folder without opening copies in editing software. The first file was named E9 Dogwood Rev2 PDF. The second started E12. The third E14. My grandmother's private archive codes. Not inspired by. Not heritage floral. E9. I called Denise. Who sent these directly? Patricia. From her email? Yes. Did she say where they came from? She said they were archival scans approved for a legacy collection. Approved by whom? I assumed the company. That's not what I asked. Denise sighed. You sound like Evelyn. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't always one. I smiled despite myself. Did you scan anything? No. I never touched the archive room. The PDFs were already made when I got them. When? October 18th. 10 days after Brittany announced the party. 3 weeks before my wedding. I wrote down the date. Did anybody else work from them? Production team, I assume. I only did finishing samples at home. Can Claire contact you? Yes. Thank you. Before we hung up, Denise said, Lauren? Yeah? I really did think this had been cleared. I know. That mattered to me. I was not interested in collecting villains. If someone acted on false information, I wanted to know that too. At 9, I closed the laptop. At 9:03, my phone rang. My mother. Adam looked at the screen from across the hotel room. Your hour is over. I noticed. You don't have to answer. I know. That was exactly why I did. Hi, Mom. No greeting. What are you doing? I leaned against the desk. Having coffee. You know what I mean. I really don't. I got a call from company counsel this morning. That interested me. Claire had moved faster than I expected. My mother continued. You are turning an internal family matter into a legal dispute. I didn't realize copyright ownership was internal to the family. Her silence was brief. Then, so that's what this is about. What did you think it was about? The necklace. It is also about the necklace. Brittany wore it for photographs. It was one evening. It was not yours to lend. It belonged to my mother, and she left it to me. The words came out more sharply than I intended. Patricia lowered her voice. Lauren, I am not going to fight with you the morning after your wedding. I almost laughed. You called me. I called because you're escalating something you don't understand. That sentence irritated me more than the necklace. What don't I understand? The company. I understand ownership. You understand paperwork. And you think those are different things? I think you left 6 years ago and now you're sitting outside the business acting as if you know what it takes to keep 30 people employed. There it was. Not denial. Justification. I kept my voice even. Who authorized the E-Series scans? Patricia ignored the question. You have your own company, your own clients. You walked away from Davis Bridal because you wanted independence. Fine. But the rest of us stayed. Who authorized the scans? Evelyn created those designs for this family. Who authorized the scans? Her breathing changed. For the first time, I knew I had reached the question she did not want. Your grandmother never wanted her life's work locked in boxes, she said. That is not authorization. Before you threaten anything, talk to your father. Why? Because if Helen Price walks away from this order, your little dispute over folders is going to become very real for people who have mortgages. I stood completely still. What order? Another pause. Then my mother realized she had said more than she intended. Call your father. Mom. But she had already ended the call. I stared at the screen. Adam came closer. What happened? She still didn't answer who authorized the scans. But she told me to ask Dad what happens to payroll if Helen Price walks. Adam leaned against the desk beside me. So now there's an order. Or there might be. And that matters? Yes. He waited. I knew what he was asking without him saying it. Did the fact that employees might be affected change what my mother had done? No. Did it change what I needed to understand before acting? Absolutely. I reopened my laptop even though my hour was technically over. Not to email Patricia. Not to send a threat. Just to write down exactly what she had said while I still remembered every word. Then I looked again at the documents Martin had sent. The ownership schedule. The partial distribution. The photographs. The PDFs Patricia had sent Denise. For the first time since Megan's message arrived, the pattern in front of me felt larger than one stolen necklace or one copied floral motif. My mother was not behaving like someone who thought she had done nothing wrong. She was behaving like someone who believed the reason she did it should matter more than whether she had the right. And now I needed to know what that reason was. My mother's warning about payroll stayed with me for the rest of that morning, but I refused to let it become the only thing I heard. There was a difference between a reason and permission, and Patricia had spent most of my life trying to blur that line whenever it suited her. If the company was in trouble, I needed to know how badly. If Helen Price represented an order large enough to matter, I needed to know what had been promised to her. And before I could decide what any of that meant, I needed to understand what exactly had happened at Brittany's engagement party while I was cutting my wedding cake 2 miles away. Megan helped me answer that faster than I expected. She called just after lunch, while Adam and I were walking back toward our hotel after spending 2 hours doing exactly what we had come to Charleston to do, nothing useful. We had wandered through side streets, stopped for coffee, and argued about whether an antique map in a shop window was charming or aggressively overpriced. My phone buzzed as we reached a corner shaded by live oaks. "I'm sorry," Megan said the moment I answered. "For what?" "For sending you the picture during your reception. You thought I should know." "I did. I just keep wondering if I should have waited." "You didn't ruin my wedding." She went quiet. I stepped away from the pedestrian traffic and leaned against a brick wall. "What's wrong?" "I have more." Adam glanced at me. I lifted one finger to tell him I needed a minute. "What kind of more?" "Pictures. The program. Some of the check-in stuff." "Why do you have check-in stuff?" "I helped with registration." That made sense. Megan had done part-time event work for Davis Bridal House for years, usually when they had trunk shows or regional bridal events. She was organized, pleasant, and good at making strangers feel as if they had been expected personally. I heard traffic behind her, then a car door close. "My husband doesn't want me involved," she said. I understood immediately. Her husband, Aaron, worked in the Davis Bridal warehouse. "You don't have to send me anything you're uncomfortable sending." "That's not what I mean." "What do you mean?" "I mean I was there, Lauren. I waited." She continued more quietly. "I knew it wasn't just an engagement party. There are moments when anger arrives quickly, and moments when it arrives in layers. This was the second kind." "What did you think it was?" "A business event with an engagement party wrapped around it." "Did everyone know?" "No. Some people thought it was just Brittany and Ryan's thing, but anyone working the event knew Helen Price was the important guest." "Why?" "Because your mother made us rehearse where she was sitting." I closed my eyes. "Send me what you have. Are you going to use it against the company?" "I don't know what I'm going to use yet." "That's not an answer." "It's the honest one." Megan exhaled. "I'm sending it." The files came through over the next 10 minutes. I waited until Adam and I were back in the hotel before opening them. If I had learned anything over the previous 24 hours, it was that looking at evidence while standing on a sidewalk made me want to act before I had finished thinking. Megan had sent a digital event program first. The cover was soft ivory with Brittany and Ryan's names in elegant script. Underneath, in smaller type, was a line that did not belong on any normal engagement program, celebrating a new chapter in the Davis bridal legacy. I read it twice. Adam sat beside me on the edge of the bed. "That's subtle." "My mother doesn't do subtle when she thinks subtle might cost money." I scrolled. Cocktail reception. Welcome remarks. Engagement toast. Private collection presentation. Buyer dinner. I stopped. Private collection presentation? Adam leaned closer. So not just an engagement party. No. The next file was a screenshot of the guest list Megan had used at check-in. Family names were mixed with people I did not recognize. Under company affiliation, several entries were obvious. Boutique owner, regional merchandiser, trade photographer, brand consultant, 2 independent bridal retailers, and Helen Price. Her name had a star beside it. I enlarged the image. Megan said Mom rehearsed where she was sitting. Adam pointed at the screen. Looks like she was the reason for the room. I opened the photographs next. The first few were harmless enough. Brittany and Ryan smiling. Champagne. Floral arrangements. My parents greeting relatives. My Aunt Marlene wearing the same navy dress she had told me she bought for both family celebrations, which apparently meant the one she actually attended. Then the photographs shifted. 3 mannequins stood under separate lights. Small placards described each gown. A screen behind them showed old black and white photographs of Grandma Evelyn working at a cutting table. Brittany appeared beside the display with a microphone in one hand. I felt my jaw tighten. There was something disturbing about watching my grandmother's life converted into branding, while the people doing it insisted the rest of us were being sentimental. Megan had also sent a short video. "Do you want to watch that?" Adam asked. "Yes." "Want me to?" I said yes, not "please supervise me." His mouth twitched. "Just checking." I pressed play. My mother stood at the front of the room. The sound quality was not perfect, but her voice was clear. For more than 50 years, Davis Bridal House has been shaped by 3 generations of women. The camera moved slightly. Behind Patricia, a large photograph of Grandma appeared on the screen. My mother continued. My mother, Evelyn, believed craftsmanship should never stand still. Tonight we're honoring where we came from while showing you where we're going. Applause. Then Brittany joined her. My sister looked polished and completely at ease. I grew up inside these dresses, she said. This collection is how I carry Grandma forward. The camera moved closer. The necklace sat at her throat. That was when I understood why its presence bothered me in a way that went beyond personal betrayal. It was not just jewelry in those photographs. It was evidence without being evidence. If you saw Brittany standing in front of Evelyn's portrait, wearing Evelyn's bridal necklace, beside gowns presented as the next chapter of Evelyn's work, the visual story wrote itself. Grandmother, granddaughter, inheritance, continuity. No one had to say Evelyn had chosen Brittany. They just had to make everyone feel as though she had. Adam paused the video. You okay? Yes. You answered too fast. I'm angry. That I believe. I looked again at Brittany's face on the frozen screen. For most of my life, my sister had been very good at knowing where the camera was without appearing to look for it. She understood rooms in a way I never had. She remembered people's names. She knew when to compliment a bride's mother and when to ignore her. She could make a plain gown look expensive by the way she stood in it. And now she was standing inside Grandma's legacy, as if someone had built the entire room to fit her. Maybe they had. I searched Brittany's public social media next. 3 weeks before the party, she had posted a photograph of lace samples with the caption, "Something beautiful is coming." A few days later, a cropped shot of a gown fitting. Then Ryan carrying boxes into the atelier with a joke about being promoted from fiancé to unpaid intern. Then, Brittany in front of a mood board, smiling. None of it proved she had organized the business side. At the time, I did not care. Every image looked like participation. Every caption made me more certain Brittany knew exactly what was happening. She planned it, I said. Adam was opening a bottle of water. What part? All of it. He looked at me. What? Being the face doesn't make her the planner. She announced the party. Yes. She wore the necklace. Yes. She's standing in front of a collection built from Grandma's archive. Yes. So, what exactly are we debating? Nothing. I'm asking whether you know she planned the buyer strategy, or whether you know she participated in it. I hated that distinction because I knew why he was making it. You're defending her. No, I'm annoying you. That you are. I'm also right. I shut the laptop harder than necessary. Congratulations. Adam nodded solemnly. Thank you. 10 minutes later, I opened it again. I did not apologize. He did not ask me to. Claire called that afternoon. By then, she had reviewed Denise's PDFs, Martin's documents, and the material Megan had sent. This changes the context, she said, because the party was a commercial presentation. Yes, but don't get ahead of yourself. The important thing now is preservation. What do you need? I'm sending a letter to company counsel. Demanding what? Not demanding production yet. Preservation. I appreciated that Claire never allowed my anger to make her vocabulary sloppy. She explained that Davis Bridal House needed to preserve potentially relevant records while the rights dispute was being evaluated. Scan records, source files, design drafts, vendor communications, event planning emails, buyer materials, internal discussions about the E-Series. Nothing about the letter froze the company. Nothing forced Patricia to hand me her computer. It simply put everyone on notice that destroying relevant information would create a different problem. What about Helen Price? I asked. I spoke with buyer counsel. You already called them? I didn't accuse anyone of infringement. I told them there is a documented dispute regarding rights in certain E-Series material included in the proposed collection. And they're pausing final paperwork. I stared at the wall. They canceled? Paused. Is there a difference? A very expensive one. Stop using the wrong word. I almost smiled. Claire continued. They have no interest in buying into a rights dispute. If Davis Bridal can show clean rights, they can proceed. If the company cannot, Helen will decide what she wants to do. So Mom is going to blame me. Probably. That was fast. You knew that before you hired me. Technically, I had only retained Claire the day before. She already understood my mother. Do we know what the proposed order is worth? Not yet. Patricia told me to ask my father what happens to payroll if Helen walks. I remember. She's using employees to make this sound like I'm threatening them. Claire's expression changed slightly. Are employees actually at risk? I don't know. Then don't decide yet that it's manipulation. That irritated me. Not because she was wrong, because I wanted it to be simpler. I'm not responsible for keeping their company alive. No, and I'm not giving away Grandma's work. I didn't ask you to. Then what are you saying? I'm saying two things can be true at the same time. Patricia can be using employees to pressure you, and the employees can still be at risk. I leaned back. There it was again. Another distinction I did not want but needed. Fine. Good. You're enjoying this. I bill by the hour. I enjoy clarity. The preservation letter went out before the end of the day. My mother called 37 minutes later. I checked the timestamp afterward because I was curious. 37 minutes. I answered from the hotel balcony while Adam stayed inside. Hi, Mom. This needs to stop. What specifically? Do not play games with me, Lauren. I'm asking a question. You contacted Helen Price's lawyers. My attorney informed them there's a rights dispute. There was no rights dispute until you created one. That's an interesting theory. Do you have any idea what you're doing? Yes. No, you don't. You are embarrassing this company in front of the most important buyer we've had in years because you're angry. Brittany wore a necklace. There it was. Reduce the problem until my reaction looked ridiculous. This is not about a necklace. It certainly started there. It started when E-Series files I own ended up on production gowns. You own boxes. No. I own the rights transferred with the listed E-Series works. A pause. Small, but real. You've been speaking to Martin and Claire. My mother made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. Of course. What does that mean? It means your grandmother spent her last years surrounded by people encouraging her to treat a family archive like a collection of legal boundaries. Maybe because she wanted boundaries. She wanted the work preserved. And that means you can scan whatever you want? That archive exists because this family built a business around her work. That still isn't permission. You sound like a contract. Contracts are useful when people decide family means they don't need to ask. Her voice sharpened. You left the company. I left my job. You walked away from responsibility. I built my own business. You built a boutique studio while the rest of us kept 30 people employed. I let the insult pass. She wanted me defending my career. I wanted an answer. Who authorized the E-series scans? Silence. Mum, you're fixated on the wrong thing. Who authorized them? You're going to cost people their jobs over a technicality. That is still not an answer. I'm trying to save a company your grandmother spent her life building. And I'm asking whether you used material you knew required permission. My mother's breathing was audible now. Then she said, very quietly, "You always did love being technically right." I almost responded. Instead, I wrote the sentence down on the notepad beside me. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Taking notes." She went silent again. That bothered her more than shouting would have. "Enjoy Charleston," she said finally. The call ended. I stared at the phone for a few seconds before going back inside. Adam looked up from the chair. "How bad?" "She accused me of risking jobs." "Did she answer your question?" "No." "Then you learned something." I nodded. "Not enough. But something?" The next morning, Megan sent one final batch of material. This time she added a message. I checked before sending. These were all things I had because Mom's assistant copied me on event logistics. I wasn't digging through anything. That distinction mattered. I opened the first email. Florist instructions. Backdrop language. VIP seating. Press arrival. Then another email confirming the order in which guests would be escorted through the display. Patricia's assistant had sent them. At the bottom, approved by P. Davis. Another chain contained revisions to Brittany's presentation timing. Another assigned Megan to keep Helen Price's party close to the display area during cocktails. Another confirmed that Ryan and Brittany would handle engagement-facing guests while Patricia and Robert handled business conversations. I kept reading. The pattern became obvious. Brittany had selected colors, approved photographs, worked with styling, prepared her remarks, promoted the event. But the buyer seating, press schedule, collection presentation, business dinner, and vendor approvals all ran through Patricia. He sat back. Adam was at the desk across the room. "You were right." He looked genuinely alarmed. "Should I record that?" "Don't ruin it." "About Brittany?" "She was involved. More than involved. But she wasn't running the business side. Your mother was." "Yes." It did not make Brittany innocent. She had worn the necklace. She had stood beneath Grandma's name. She had allowed herself to be presented as the next generation, while wearing artwork I owned behind her. But the architecture of the event belonged to Patricia. That mattered. My phone rang. Robert. I almost let it go to voicemail. My father and I had barely spoken since before the wedding. He had sent a text that morning saying he loved me and was sorry the timing had become impossible. Impossible. As though the date had been produced by weather, I answered. "Hi, Dad. Lorraine." He sounded tired. "Your mother says you've contacted the buyer." "My lawyer informed their counsel there's a rights dispute." "I know." "Then why ask?" "I didn't." I waited. Robert cleared his throat. "We need to talk." "About what?" "The company. I've been told repeatedly I don't understand the company. That's why I'm calling." I looked toward Adam. He could not hear my father, but he watched my face. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow." "When you're back. We'll be in Savannah by afternoon, not the office." That surprised me. "Where?" He named a diner on the south side of the city, nowhere near Davis Bridal House and nowhere my mother would casually appear. "Why there?" "Because I don't want to have this conversation at the office." I stood. My father lowered his voice. "If you want to know why everyone chose Brittany's party, you need to understand what your mother showed them." For a moment, I thought he meant the collection. Then he added, "You need to see the numbers." The line went quiet after we hung up, but I stayed standing with the phone in my hand. Until then, I had been following a trail that began with my grandmother's necklace and led into a private archive my mother had no right to use. Now my father was telling me there was another trail underneath it. Money. And if Patricia had convinced an entire family that missing my wedding was the price of saving Davis Bridal House, I wanted to know whether the company was truly in danger or whether my mother had simply found the one excuse she knew everyone would be too afraid to question. My father chose a diner I had passed 100 times and never once entered. It sat off a busy road on the south side of Savannah, the kind of place with laminated menus, coffee that appeared before you asked for it, and booths deep enough to make private conversations feel possible even when they were not. Adam dropped me off a few minutes before 3 and said he would find somewhere nearby to work. I had told him he could come inside if he wanted. He had told me this was probably one of those conversations where my father needed to decide whether he was talking to his daughter or to an audience. For once, I agreed without arguing. Robert was already there when I walked in. He had chosen a booth near the back, away from the windows, with a yellow legal pad placed beside his coffee. He looked older than he had at the last family dinner I attended, though I knew most of that was exhaustion rather than age. My father had spent almost 30 years making Davis Bridal House look financially calmer than it really was. If Patricia was the person who convinced customers the company had a future, Robert was the person who made sure suppliers were paid long enough for that future to arrive. He stood when he saw me. "Hi, sweetheart." I sat before he could hug me. "Hi, Dad." He noticed. He did not comment. A waitress arrived, and I ordered coffee I did not want, because it gave both of us 30 seconds to look at something other than each other. Robert waited until she left before opening the folder beside him. "I'm not giving you company books," he said. "I didn't ask for them." "I know. I need that clear anyway." "Then what are you showing me?" "Enough for you to understand the situation." He slid one page across the table. It was not a detailed financial statement. No customer names, no full balance sheet, no confidential vendor terms. Just a summary Robert had apparently prepared himself. Annual revenue, payroll, retail leases, inventory, debt service, cash reserves. I looked at the first number. 4.6 million in revenue last year? Roughly. That doesn't sound like a company about to collapse. It isn't. I looked up. That answer surprised me enough that he almost smiled. I thought Mom told everyone this buyer was saving the business. She told them the buyer could keep us from cutting deeper. That is not the same thing. No. I glanced back at the page. Then explain it. Robert folded his hands. We expanded too fast. That sounded more like him. 2 years earlier, Davis Bridal House had opened a second showroom outside Savannah and a smaller, appointment-based location farther inland. I knew about both, but I had not paid attention to the financing. By then, I had been gone from the company for years, and avoiding Patricia's business decisions had become one of the cleaner boundaries in my life. Robert pointed to the lease figures. The second showroom underperformed from the beginning. The third location isn't bad, but it isn't carrying its own overhead yet. We also bought too much inventory ahead of the spring season. Why? Your mother expected sales growth. Did you? Not at that level. Did you say that? Yes. And she did it anyway. She wasn't alone in the decision. That was my father's first attempt to spread responsibility across the room. I let it pass for the moment. He continued. We're not bankrupt. We're not missing payroll tomorrow. But our working capital is tight. We drew more on the commercial line than I wanted. The lender has been patient because the underlying business is still healthy enough, but they want to see improvement. How much improvement? Committed revenue helps. And Helen Price gives you that. If her company places the order at the level we discussed, yes. How large? Robert hesitated. I waited. Initial projection was around $850,000 in wholesale revenue over the seasonal cycle. I leaned back. That's the number Mom built the whole weekend around. It's a meaningful order. It's not $850,000 in the bank. No. Deposit? Part on signing, milestone payments, balance tied to delivery terms. So the company still has to produce the gowns. Obviously. Buy materials. Yes. Pay labor. Yes. Carry costs until later payments arrive. Yes. I tapped the paper. Then when Mom tells people this deal saves 30 jobs, she's simplifying. Robert looked tired again. She's not entirely wrong. I didn't say wrong. I said simplifying. He was quiet. That distinction mattered because my mother loved numbers only after they had been turned into stories. $850,000 in projected wholesale revenue became $850,000 at risk. Tight working capital became the company might not survive. A possible staffing reduction became 30 families depending on Brittany's party. I looked farther down the page. How many employees? 31 right now. Full and part-time combined. How many were you planning to lay off? Planning is the wrong word. How many? We modeled scenarios. How many? He rubbed the side of his coffee cup. 6 positions under the most aggressive cost reduction. Maybe 8 if the spring numbers deteriorated. I held his eyes. So not 30. No. And if Helen's order closed? We likely avoid most of that. Most. Yes. That was the first time since my wedding that the employee argument became real instead of rhetorical. Not 30 people walking into unemployment the next morning, but maybe 6, maybe 8. People with mortgages, childcare, prescriptions, tuition, ordinary lives that had nothing to do with my mother's ego or my sister's necklace. I hated that because Patricia had used those people like a shield, and I still could not pretend the shield was empty. Why did the family need to attend? I asked. Robert looked at the table. Your mother thought the buyer needed to see continuity. Continuity. Family ownership. Heritage. The story behind the brand. The story where everyone is physically present except the granddaughter who owns the archive they're presenting. His jaw tightened. That part wasn't my idea. Which part was? He did not answer immediately. I opened the event program on my phone and set it beside his hand. Buyer dinner, private collection presentation, press photography. This wasn't an engagement party that accidentally had business guests. No. Did you know that before the wedding? Yes. The word was small. It hurt more than I expected. Did you know the collection used E-series material? I knew archival material was being used. That is not what I asked. He looked at me. You sound like your mother when you do that. No. Mom changes the question. I repeat it. He looked away first. I knew there were old Evelyn designs being adapted. I did not review which folders they came from. Did you know Grandma's private archive had been distributed to me in September? Yes. Did you know Mom had not asked me for a license? Yes. The diner seemed suddenly too bright. Then why didn't you call me? Robert took a breath. Because there wasn't time for another family fight. I stared at him. Dad, I know how that sounds. No, I don't think you do. Lauren, did you think I would say yes? He stopped. That was the question. Not whether Patricia thought the archive belonged morally to the family. Not whether the company needed money. Not whether Grandma would have wanted people employed. Would I have agreed if they had asked? My father's silence told me he had already done the calculation. You thought I'd say no, I said. We thought you would make it difficult. That is not the same answer. You had been out of the company for 6 years. You wanted nothing to do with the business. I wanted nothing to do with Mom running my life. You know what I mean. No, I know exactly what you mean. You thought I might say no, so you decided it was easier if nobody asked. Robert's face hardened slightly. That's not fair. I almost laughed. No, what's unfair about it? We were trying to keep a business stable. And I was getting married. That's not comparable. There it was. The sentence I think he regretted before the last syllable left his mouth. I sat back. You're right. Robert looked at me, wary now. My wedding and your wholesale order weren't comparable. Lauren, one belonged to your daughter, one belonged to your company. You decided which mattered more. That is not what I meant. It's what you did. He lowered his voice. Your wedding was going to happen either way. I felt something inside me become very still. So that's how you justified it. I'm explaining the decision. You're explaining why my pain was affordable. His eyes lifted sharply. I had not planned that sentence. It arrived because it was the cleanest description I had. The wedding would still happen. Adam would still marry me. My friends would still come. The cake had been paid for. The venue would not disappear because my parents were missing. From a business perspective, my wedding was a loss the family could absorb. The buyer was not. I looked back at the page. Who did Mom show this to? Not this exact sheet. Then what? High-level projections, staffing scenarios. Which relatives? He named them. Aunt Marlene, who still worked alterations 3 days a week. Cousin Eric, whose sister managed shipping. Megan, because Aaron worked in the warehouse. My Uncle Thomas, who had helped guarantee financing on equipment years earlier and still treated Davis Bridal House as if he owned more of it than he did. There were others. Not every relative had a direct financial tie, but enough did. Mom told them layoffs were possible. Yes. Did she tell them 6 to 8 positions? Robert hesitated again. She said 30 employees depended on the business. That is not the same statement. No. I closed my eyes briefly. Patricia had not technically lied. That was what made her good at this. 30 employees did depend on the company. The buyer order might reduce the chance of layoffs. Relatives did have a reason to care. She simply arranged the facts, so the only moral choice seemed to be hers. Come to Brittany's party and support 30 workers. Or attend Lauren's wedding and risk the business Grandma built. There had never been room in that framing for a third option. Ask Lauren. Negotiate a license. Hold the buyer presentation separately. Tell Helen Price the rights needed to be cleared. My mother had turned consent into an obstacle before anyone outside the immediate family even knew consent was missing. I looked at my father. Did anyone ask why the presentation had to be on my wedding day? Your mother said Helen was only in Savannah that weekend. That explains the weekend. Robert did not answer. It doesn't explain the day. He rubbed his forehead. I wasn't involved in event scheduling. But you knew. Yes. Did you object? I told her it was going to cause damage. Damage. He winced. That was the word? I don't remember the exact word. I bet you remember what Mom said. He looked at me. She said you'd be angry either way. I nodded slowly. That sounds like her. She said changing the business opportunity wouldn't make you trust her more. That also sounds like her. And she said you had Adam, your friends, your clients. You weren't going to be alone. I looked away toward the front windows. Outside, cars moved past the diner, as if nothing in my life had changed. Maybe it had not. Maybe what had changed was that I finally understood the mathematics my family used when deciding whose feelings counted. I was never alone, I said. That wasn't the point. I know. Do you? He did not answer. We sat in silence until the waitress returned and refilled both cups. She asked if we wanted pie. My father said no. I almost said yes out of spite, then decided I did not need to make dessert symbolic. When she left, Robert said, I'm sorry I missed your wedding. It was the first direct apology I had received from either parent. I wanted it to matter more. I believe you. His face softened. That doesn't fix it. The softness disappeared. I know. Maybe he did. Maybe he was only beginning to. I slid the summary page back toward him. Did Mom tell Helen the company had rights to the archive? I don't know what language was used. Did you sign anything? A preliminary term sheet, nothing final. That caught my attention. What did it say about intellectual property? I'd have to check. Claire is going to ask. I assumed she would. Dad, did you sign it? Patricia signed for the company. I reviewed the financial terms. That was careful wording. What rights representation did it contain? I don't remember exactly. I'm sure company counsel does. Robert sighed. You are not going to let this go. No. Even if the order falls apart? I thought about the seamstresses, the warehouse, the 6 positions, maybe 8. Then I thought about E9, Grandma's handwriting, the necklace, my mother calculating that my own wedding would keep me occupied. I'm not going to pretend permission happened because the consequences of asking are inconvenient. He leaned back. I don't know what you want me to say. Nothing right now. Then why did you come? Because you said I needed to see the numbers. And now? Now I know Mom had a real problem. Robert looked relieved too early. I continued. That doesn't make her solution legitimate. His relief vanished. I left the diner 40 minutes later with no company documents in my bag and more certainty than I had walked in with. The crisis was not fake. That mattered. Davis Bridal House was not a dying business staged for sympathy. It had revenue, staff, customers, and a genuine cash flow problem made worse by expansion decisions. Helen Price's order could materially improve the next year. If the order failed, people who had never touched Grandma's necklace could lose hours or jobs. But there was another truth sitting beside it. My mother had known I might refuse. My father had known I might refuse. That was why they had not asked. Adam picked me up outside. He waited until I buckled my seatbelt before asking, How bad? The company is actually struggling. Bankrupt? No. Payroll tomorrow? No. Then struggling how? Too much expansion. debt, inventory, tight working capital. The buyer order would help stabilize them. How many jobs? 6 to 8 may be at risk if things get worse. Maybe fewer if the order closes. Adam pulled away from the curb. That's still real. I know. You sound angry at me for saying it. I'm angry because Mom said it first. That doesn't make it false. I know that too. We drove for several blocks. Finally, he asked, "Does it change what you want?" I looked out the window. I don't know yet. That answer bothered me. The version of me from 2 days earlier would have preferred something cleaner. My family had done something wrong. I found proof. I stopped them. End of story. Now there were employees standing behind the wrongdoers, and Patricia had made sure I could see every one of them. It was manipulative. It was also effective. The following afternoon, Claire called me into a video conference. I have the term sheet language. How? Buyer counsel shared the relevant section because they want the rights issue resolved before they spend more time on due diligence. I opened my notebook. Tell me. Claire read carefully. Davis Bridal represents that it has, or prior to commercialization, will secure all necessary rights, permissions, and licenses required for the proposed collection. I frowned. So Mom told them she had the rights. No. I looked up. Claire raised one eyebrow. Listen to the words. I read them again. Has or prior to commercialization will secure. She left herself room. Yes. So this is not evidence she lied. Correct. I appreciated Claire most when she ruined conclusions I wanted. Then what does it give us? Something useful. It establishes that clean rights were understood to be a condition before final commercialization. Buyer counsel agrees. So if Davis Bridal doesn't get a license, the buyer does not have to close on this collection. Could Patricia argue the company already has rights? She can. Then she has to support that position. With what? That's what we're finding out. I looked at my notes from the diner. My father knew I might refuse. Claire paused. He said that? He said they thought I would make it difficult. He admitted that was part of why nobody asked. Document the conversation while it's fresh. I already did. Good? I hesitated. There are actually employees at risk. I assumed there might be. 6 to 8 positions if things get worse. Claire waited. I hate that Mom used them. That doesn't mean you have to ignore them. I also don't want to spend the rest of this dispute being told I'm responsible for every consequence. Then decide what you are responsible for. That sounded infuriatingly simple. I'm responsible for my decisions. Yes. Not Patricia's. Yes. Not Robert's. Yes. Not the company borrowing too much. Yes. But if I have 2 legal options and one hurts innocent people more than the other, I'm still responsible for which one I choose. Claire was quiet for a second. That sounds like something you should remember. I wrote it down. Not because I liked it, because I knew I would need it. That evening, Adam and I ate dinner at home surrounded by wedding gifts we had not opened yet. There was something surreal about cutting packing tape off a toaster, while my lawyer emailed me questions about copyright ownership. Adam unwrapped a set of wine glasses. So, what do you want? I looked up. What? Not what do you want your mother to lose. What do you want? The question was harder than it should have been. I want them to stop using the archive. That's an action. I want Grandma credited correctly. That's one. I want control of the archive handled properly. Tfo. And I want nobody using my silence as permission ever again. Adam nodded. 3. I thought about it. I want the company to survive if it can survive without taking what isn't theirs. That sounds different from 2 days ago. 2 days ago I wanted Brittany to choke on the necklace. That was also understandable. I'm serious. So am I. I smiled despite myself. My phone rang. Claire. It was late enough that I answered immediately. What happened? I got part of the event scheduling chain. I put the wine glass down. From company counsel? Yes, limited voluntary exchange while we're discussing standstill terms. And the buyer did not choose the engagement party date. I felt my shoulders tighten. What does that mean? Helen Price confirmed the weekend she could be in Savannah. She did not tell Davis Bridal which day to hold the showcase. I stood. Who did? Patricia's side selected the event day. I heard Adam stop moving behind me. Claire continued. There's more. I haven't finished reviewing it, so don't jump ahead. What more? One email references your wedding schedule. My hand tightened around the phone. References it how? I'm not reading it to you until I've reviewed the full chain. Claire. Lauren. I closed my eyes. Fine. I'll call you tomorrow morning. When the call ended, I stood in the middle of our kitchen while Adam waited. The buyer picked the weekend, I said, not the party date. Adam's expression changed. And your mother did? Looks like it. I thought back to every relative who had told me the timing was impossible. Every person who said Helen Price had only one date. Every apology built around the idea that nobody had a choice. For the first time, I understood that the most important number my father had shown me was not $850,000. It was one day. There had been an entire weekend available, and somebody inside Davis Bridal House had deliberately chosen mine. Claire called me at 8 the next morning, which meant she had already been working long enough to become annoyed before I finished my first cup of coffee. Adam was still asleep when I carried my laptop into the living room and closed the bedroom door behind me. I've reviewed the scheduling chain, Claire said. Company counsel agreed to a limited standstill last night. What exactly does that mean? For now, Davis Bridal won't put additional E-Series material into new production. Nobody destroys or alters relevant records, and both sides exchange a narrow set of documents while we determine whether this can be resolved without emergency litigation. So Mom agreed? Company counsel agreed. Do not confuse those things. That distinction told me enough. Claire shared her screen. The email chain began with Helen Price's assistant confirming that Helen would be in Savannah from Friday afternoon through Sunday morning. She was available for a private presentation either Friday evening or Saturday before dinner. Saturday, my wedding day. I scrolled. Patricia's assistant had forwarded the availability to my mother. There were messages about catering, press access, florist timing, buyer transportation. Nothing remarkable until Claire stopped at one email. Read this carefully, she said. It was from Patricia to the event planner. Lauren's ceremony runs late afternoon. She'll be occupied, so keep the archive presentation focused and move Helen to the buyer dinner on schedule. I read it once, then again. The sentence did not contain an insult. That was almost worse. My mother had not written that she wanted to hurt me. She had not called me selfish. She had not said my wedding did not matter. She had written about it as logistics. Lauren's ceremony runs late afternoon. She'll be occupied, like rain in the forecast, like traffic, like a loading dock being unavailable for 2 hours. Claire was saying something about the surrounding emails, but for several seconds I could not hear her properly. Lauren, I'm here. Do you understand what this establishes? She knew. Yes. She knew the ceremony time. Yes. And she picked Saturday anyway. The chain shows her team selected Saturday after receiving Helen's availability. It does not tell us every reason she selected it. I almost laughed. You're protecting me from conclusions again. I'm protecting the difference between evidence and emotion. My emotion is doing fine. That is obviously false. I stared at the screen. Is there anything showing why Friday wasn't used? Not yet. There are notes about wanting family attendance, press photographs, and a larger presentation window on Saturday. Nothing I would call a confession. She didn't need one. For your relationship with her? Probably not. For a legal claim? Different question. I knew that. Still, I copied the email into my notes exactly as written. Not because I expected a judge to care about my wedding. Because I needed to remember later that I had not imagined the calculation. After the call, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a while. A month earlier, when our invitations went out, my mother had called to say she liked the paper stock. That memory returned with irritating clarity. Very you, Patricia had said. What does that mean? Simple. Expensive without trying to look expensive. I'm choosing to take that as a compliment. It is 1. She had asked what time the ceremony started. 4:30. She had asked when dinner would be served. Around 6:30, she knew. 2 weeks later, Brittany announced the engagement party for the same date. I remembered calling Patricia immediately. You knew my wedding was that day. Yes. Then why would Brittany schedule this? Helen Price is only in Savannah that weekend. The weekend is not a day. Lauren, don't start. That had been the phrase. Don't start. As though the conflict began when I noticed it. At the time, I thought Patricia was choosing Brittany because Brittany had always been easier for her to celebrate. Brittany stayed in the company. Brittany liked the events, the photos, the dinners, the rituals of being a Davis in public. I had spent years refusing those things. That explanation had hurt, but at least it was emotional. The email was colder. My wedding had solved a problem for her. I would be somewhere else. I would be occupied. I would not walk into the room, see Grandma's private artwork on mannequins, and ask where it came from before Helen Price saw the full presentation. I picked up my phone. For the first time since the wedding, I called Brittany. She answered on the second ring. Well, this is unexpected. Her voice was too light. I have a question. Good morning to you too. Did you know Mom picked your party date because I couldn't be there? Silence. Not long, but long enough. What are you talking about? The scheduling emails. Oh my God. That isn't an answer. You're reading private company emails now? My lawyer received them through counsel. Of course she did. Did you know? Brittany sighed. Helen was only available that weekend. That's what Mom said. Helen was available Friday evening too. I wasn't handling her calendar. Did you know Mom had my ceremony schedule when she chose Saturday? Everybody had your ceremony schedule. You sent invitations. I closed my eyes. Brittany, what do you want me to say? The truth would be efficient. You always do that. Do what? Talk like you're taking a deposition. I'm asking whether you knew. I knew you would be at your wedding. I gripped the phone. That isn't what I asked. Fine. Yes. I knew Mom thought Saturday was better because you wouldn't be there creating a fight in front of Helen. There it was. Not from Patricia. From Brittany. For a moment, I could not speak. Brittany continued before I could. And before you make that sound worse than it was, you had already made it very clear you wanted nothing to do with Davis Bridal. I wanted nothing to do with working for Mom. Same difference. No. To you, maybe. You knew the E-Series archive was mine. I knew Grandma left you boxes. Copyrights too. I did not read the probate paperwork, Lauren. Did you ever ask whether the collection was licensed? Legal was handled. Who told you that? Mom. And that was enough? Yes. She said it so quickly that I knew the answer was partly true. Brittany had grown up believing Patricia handled the ugly machinery behind everything. Contracts, payroll, vendors, insurance, permissions. Brittany stood in front. Patricia made sure the floor existed beneath her. But there was another question. Did you know I would object? Silence again. Brittany, I knew you would be difficult. I laughed once. Dad used almost the same word. Maybe because it's true. Did you know I would say no? I knew you would make it about ownership instead of the company. That means yes. No, it means I know you. Then why didn't you call me? Because I was getting engaged. That party was a buyer presentation. It was both. Using artwork I owned. You keep saying that like you invented Grandma. I stood up so fast, the chair scraped the floor. I am not claiming Grandma. You act like you are. You left. I stayed. Mom stayed. Dad stayed. I spent years working there while you built your perfect little studio where nobody could tell you what to do. I could hear the wound underneath the accusation. At the time, I was too angry to care. So staying entitled you to the necklace too? Brittany's voice sharpened. Mom said the estate hadn't finished distributing it. It was specifically left to me. She said Grandma would have wanted it photographed with the collection. Did Grandma tell you that? No. Did Martin? No. Did I? No. Then you knew enough to ask. She went quiet. That silence was different. Not defensive. Guilty. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped. I didn't think wearing it for an hour would matter this much. It mattered enough for you to wear it. That's not fair. It's exactly fair. You always think you're the one who understands Grandma better. I almost answered immediately. Then I stopped. Because that accusation landed somewhere I did not want to examine yet. I'm not talking about who understood her better. You always are. No. I'm talking about whether you used something that was mine, because asking might have gotten you an answer you didn't want. Brittany breathed out slowly. You want me to say Mom planned this whole thing to hurt you? No? Yes, you do. I want you to stop telling me what I want. She was trying to save the company. And using my wedding made that easier? She thought you would cause a scene, so she created one somewhere I couldn't attend. Hot, Lauren. What? You really think everything is about you? The sentence was so familiar it barely hurt. I had heard versions of it since childhood whenever I asked why Brittany received something I was told to share, or why Patricia changed plans without asking, or why family peace always required the same people to stay quiet. This time, I did not defend myself. I called you for one answer, I said. You gave it to me. What answer? You knew I would object, and you were willing to proceed because Mom told you legal was handled. That is not what I said. It's exactly what you said. You twist everything. I wrote it down. She hung up. I stood in the kitchen with the phone still against my ear. For a few seconds, I was furious enough to call back. Then the anger disappeared so abruptly, it frightened me. I sat down. When Adam came in 20 minutes later, he found me at the table with the laptop closed and my coffee untouched. He looked toward the bedroom. You've been up a while. Yeah. Claire? And Brittany. That got his attention. He pulled out the chair across from me. How did that go? She knew. He waited. She knew Mom chose Saturday partly because I'd be stuck at the wedding. She knew I would object to the archive. She says Mom told her legal was handled. And you believe her? About that part? Probably. Anything else? I looked down at my hands. She said I always act like I understood Grandma better. Adam said nothing. I hated him a little for that. You're supposed to tell me she's wrong. Do you want me to? No. Then I'm not going to. I stood and walked to the window. There were still a few wedding flowers in vases around the apartment because people had insisted we take them home. They were starting to brown at the edges. She knew I'd say no, I said. I heard you. Dad knew. Brittany knew. Mom definitely knew. Yes. So nobody asked. No. I pressed my fingertips against the glass. For the first time since the wedding, the pain arrived without anger protecting it. She didn't miss my wedding. Adam stayed quiet. I turned around. She scheduled around it. My voice broke on the last word. That annoyed me. Then I started crying anyway. Not beautifully. Not dramatically. I sat on the edge of the couch and covered my face while 9 months of planning, family calls, polite excuses, empty chairs, and that single word occupied collapsed into something much simpler. My mother had known exactly where I would be. She had counted on it. Adam sat beside me but did not tell me to calm down or that Patricia did not deserve my tears. He just put his arm around me and waited until I could breathe normally again. After a while, I said, I hate that I'm crying over this. Why? Because I already knew they chose the party. You knew what happened. I know. This is why. That was true. Humiliation is one thing when you can still tell yourself people were careless. It becomes something else when you see the planning. I wiped my face. I'm okay. Adam handed me a tissue. That sentence has lost credibility. I'm functional. That I believe. I laughed weakly. We sat there a few more minutes. Then Adam asked, Can I ask you something you're going to hate? You've been doing that all week. If you can stop the collection, do you want the company to fail? I looked at him. No. Fast answer. I don't. What if stopping the collection causes layoffs? That isn't the same as me causing layoffs. I agree. But you know more now than you knew Saturday. I stood and carried my cup to the sink even though it was still full. I'm not giving away the archive because Mom overextended the company. I didn't say you should. I'm not responsible for the debt. I know. I'm not responsible for the expansion. I know. I'm not responsible for Patricia promising a buyer something she hadn't licensed. I know. I turned. Then what exactly are you asking? Adam leaned forward. I'm asking whether your goal is to protect what's yours or make sure your mother loses what she wants. I did not answer. Because 3 days earlier, those had been the same thing in my head. Now, they were separating. I could protect Grandma's archive. I could demand correct attribution. I could stop unlicensed use. I could require compensation. None of those things required me to enjoy the possibility that Davis Bridal House might collapse. But there was a darker answer, too. A part of me wanted Patricia to lose the buyer. Not because that outcome was necessary, because she had missed my wedding for it. I wanted the thing she had chosen over me to disappear. Recognizing that did not make me proud. It did make me useful to myself. I don't know yet, I said. Adam nodded. That sounds more honest. My phone buzzed. Claire had sent a strategy memo. 3 headings appeared on the first page. Aggressive enforcement. Negotiated commercial license. Extended standstill pending rights review. I read them slowly. 3 paths. None simple. None free. None guaranteed to leave everyone untouched. Claire called 10 minutes later. I assume you saw it. I did. Do not choose today. I wasn't planning to. That's a lie. Fine, I was planning to. I know. I looked at the first option. If I push hard enough, can we stop them? Possibly. If necessary, we can evaluate injunctive relief. But litigation takes money, time, and evidence. It also does not answer what happens to the buyer relationship afterward. And the license? That depends on whether you are willing to let Davis Bridal use E-Series material under terms you control. For money, attribution, access restrictions, and whatever reasonable conditions we negotiate. And if Patricia refuses, then she refuses. I looked at the third option. Standstill? Buys time. It does not solve the commercial problem. I thought about my father's numbers. $850,000 in projected wholesale revenue. 6 to 8 possible positions. 31 employees total. Then the email. She'll be occupied. I closed the document. For the first time, I told Claire. I'm not sure the most satisfying answer is the smartest one. That's usually when clients become expensive. Thank you. I mean, emotionally expensive. That's somehow worse. She laughed. Then her tone softened. You don't owe Patricia a rescue. I know. You also don't have to choose the most destructive legal option to prove you have rights. I know that too. Good. Sit with both. After we hung up, I printed the strategy memo and placed it beside the photograph Megan had sent from the party. Brittany beneath Grandma's name. Grandma's necklace. The dogwood gown. For days I had looked at that photograph and asked one question. How do I stop them? Now the question had changed. I already knew I had the documents, the lawyer, and enough evidence to make continuation difficult. The harder question was what I wanted to happen after they stopped. And for the first time, I understood that winning against my mother and making a wise decision might not be the same thing. Claire waited 2 days before asking me to choose a direction. I suspect she did it deliberately, because on the first day I would have chosen whatever hurt my mother fastest. By the second, I had stopped imagining Patricia watching Helen Price walk away and started asking the question Adam had left me with. If I stripped away the part of me that wanted revenge, what outcome could I defend 6 months later? Claire and I met in her office on a gray January morning. Martin joined by video because the archive inspection was scheduled for that afternoon. Claire had printed the same 3 options she had sent me before, but this time each had numbers beside it. Aggressive enforcement first, she said. If Davis Bridal resumes production using disputed E-Series material, we can evaluate seeking injunctive relief. That means motions, affidavits, potentially expert declarations, and legal expense before you know whether the buyer waits around. How much expense? She gave me a range that made me stop moving my coffee toward my mouth. That's before trial? That's before anyone sensible should be talking about trial. I put the cup down. My studio did well. I had business savings. I was not poor, and I was not dependent on my parents. But I also had rent, insurance, employees of my own, equipment, taxes, and a mortgage with Adam. I could fund a serious legal response. I could not pretend burning money for 2 years would make me principled. Claire tapped the second option. Commercial license. You retain ownership. Davis Bridal pays for defined use. Attribution is corrected. Archive access is controlled. Buyer gets clean rights. You get compensated. And Patricia gets the collection. If she accepts the terms. The fact that I hated that answer told me something important about myself. Claire noticed. You're allowed to dislike the result. I don't want her rewarded. Then define reward. She gets the order she wanted badly enough to schedule around my wedding. She also pays you, accepts your ownership, corrects the marketing, loses unrestricted access to the archive, and operates under reporting requirements. When you say it like that, You make it sound less satisfying. My job is rarely to maximize satisfaction. I looked at the third option. Extended standstill. Useful if both sides need more time. Not a permanent solution. Helen Price isn't going to hold a seasonal buying decision open forever. What would you do? Claire leaned back. I don't answer that question for clients. Convenient. I can tell you what I see. You have leverage. You have a documented rights chain. You have source evidence. You also have a company that appears capable of paying for a license if the commercial structure works. If your goal is stewardship rather than destruction, negotiation is rational. And if my goal is both, then decide which one gets to drive. That afternoon, Martin and an independent archivist met me at Davis Bridal House to inspect the E-Series room. Claire insisted on an outside archivist because she wanted current condition records created by someone who did not share my last name. It was the first time I had entered the building since before Grandma died. The front showroom still smelled exactly the same. Fabric, wood polish, perfume, steam from the alterations area. Brides sat with mothers and friends beneath soft lights while sales consultants moved gowns in and out of fitting rooms. For a moment, my body remembered the place before my mind did. I had spent my 20s there. Not happily all the time, but not miserably either. That was the part family stories often flattened. Leaving Davis Bridal had been the right decision. It did not mean every year before I left had been awful. One of the senior seamstresses, Rosa Delgado, saw me near the back hallway and stopped. Look who finally remembers where we are. She opened her arms. I hugged her. Rosa had worked with Grandma for more than 20 years and possessed the terrifying ability to look at a bride from across the room and know which side seam needed half an inch. How was the wedding? She asked. Beautiful. Her expression shifted just enough for me to know she had heard about the rest. I'm glad. Thank you. She glanced at Martin and the archivist. You here for the boxes? Yes. Your grandmother would be happy somebody is finally making everyone behave around those things. I laughed. That might be optimistic. Rosa lowered her voice. I heard the big order is on hold. I did not answer immediately. I'm not asking you to fix anything, she said. I just want to know if we should be worried. That depends on what the company agrees to. She nodded. That sounds like a lawyer answer. I've been spending too much time with one. Rosa smiled, then looked toward the workroom. We already cut overtime. Nobody's panicking yet. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for something you didn't do. That sentence stayed with me. Then she added, almost casually, Your sister's been covering half the floor herself since everybody started whispering about the buyer. I looked at her. Brittany? She's good with brides. I must have made some expression, because Rosa laughed. Don't look like that. Like what? Like I told you, she can perform surgery. I know Brittany can sell. No, you know Brittany is pretty. Those aren't the same thing. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Rosa had no reason to flatter Brittany. If anything, she had spent years complaining that my sister left coffee cups too close to fabric. She can get a nervous bride to stop apologizing for her body in 5 minutes, Rosa said. Your grandmother noticed that before any of you did. I hated how quickly I wanted to reduce the compliment. That was when I caught myself. For years, I had described Brittany as good at being looked at. The phrase sounded clever. It also conveniently made her talent small. Maybe Patricia had exploited Brittany's need for recognition. Maybe Brittany had knowingly benefited from what they did to me. Both could be true, without requiring Brittany to be useless. I'll remember that, I said. Rosa shrugged. Do what you want with it. The E-Series room was behind a coated interior door. Martin documented the access before we entered. Nothing about the room looked dramatic enough to justify months of conflict. Flat files, archival boxes, climate monitors, shelving. The kind of quiet storage space most people could walk through without realizing that a single folder might contain the work of a lifetime. The independent archivist began checking box numbers against the estate schedule. I walked past E9. The dogwood drawing was still there. The original, not stolen, copied. Somehow that distinction made me angrier. Patricia had not needed to remove the archive. She only needed access long enough to reproduce it. Martin watched me examine the sleeve. You okay? Yes. That answer runs in your family. I'm beginning to understand that. He smiled slightly. The inspection lasted almost 3 hours. There was no dramatic discovery. No missing secret folder. No handwritten confession tucked under a sketch. That was good. Real cases should not require magic. The problem was already clear enough. Someone had accessed material the company no longer controlled, created scans, used those scans in a commercial collection, and assumed the person who owned the rights would either never notice or never force the issue. When I left the building, I called Claire from my car. Draft the license. There was a short silence. You sure? No. Good enough for a first draft. I'm not giving them a discount. I didn't suggest one. I want market royalties. Yes. Upfront fee. Yes. Legal costs. Reasonable documented costs. Independent custody of the archive. That will need operational detail. No more company-controlled storage. Agreed. And Brittany cannot be marketed as the creator of Grandma's E-series work. Claire paused. Be careful with wording. We can require accurate attribution. We cannot use your license to control every sentence Brittany ever says about her grandmother. Fine. Accurate attribution. What about approvals? I approve use of E-series material. Personally, I thought about what would happen if every hemline change required my signature. No, specific archive uses, not ordinary production decisions. Better. And eventually, I want a designated independent steward able to handle routine approvals. Also better. I realized Claire was making me narrow power rather than maximize it. That mattered. I did not want to replace Patricia as the person who controlled everybody by making every decision flow through me. I wanted ownership respected. Those were not the same goal. Over the next week, Claire turned my anger into contract language. The first draft included an upfront licensing payment large enough to acknowledge that Davis Bridal had already used source material without clearing rights, but not so large that the company could reasonably claim I was using the dispute to extort them. There were ongoing royalties tied to actual sales, reporting obligations, audit rights, defined attribution language, reimbursement of reasonable legal and archival expenses, and a requirement that the physical E-series archive move to independent climate-controlled storage. For future E-series use, the company would submit the specific source artwork being proposed. I, or a designated archive steward, could approve or reject that use. We would not approve neckline changes. We would not approve fabric purchasing. We would not approve marketing budgets. My control stopped where my rights stopped. I liked that sentence enough to write it in the margin. The meeting took place in late January at Davis Bridal's conference room. Patricia sat at one end of the table. Robert sat beside company counsel. Brittany was there too, though she looked irritated about being included in something that involved binders. Helen Price joined by video with her lawyer. Claire sat beside me. Martin did not attend because the rights had already been transferred to me. He was no longer necessary for the commercial negotiation. Company counsel went through the main terms. Robert asked questions about royalty rates. Reasonable questions. He wanted to know how returns would be calculated, when royalties accrued, how discounts affected the base, whether archive storage costs were fixed. I answered when the question was mine. Claire answered when it was legal. No one raised their voice. For almost 40 minutes it felt possible. Then Helen said, "From our side, if the rights are clean and the attribution is corrected, we're comfortable resuming diligence." Robert looked relieved. Company counsel nodded. Even Brittany leaned back, as if the worst part might be over. Patricia had barely spoken. That worried me more than if she had started angry. Finally, she tapped one paragraph with her index finger. This approval provision. Claire looked down. What about it? Lauren retains final approval over use of Evelyn archive material. Lauren or a designated archive steward. That is not better. It keeps review from depending entirely on Lauren's personal availability. Patricia looked at me. So the company submits requests to my daughter. For archive rights I own. There. Her voice sharpened. That. What? The way you say it. I waited. Patricia looked toward Helen's image on the screen, and then back at me. This company existed before Lauren decided she was a curator. I felt Claire's hand move slightly beside her notebook. A warning not to bite. I did anyway, just carefully. And Grandma owned these works before the company decided they were convenient. Company counsel intervened. Patricia, the scope is narrow. Operational decisions remain with the company. I understand the scope. Then what is the objection? Patricia turned toward him. I am not asking my own daughter for permission to use my mother's work. The room changed. Not dramatically. No gasps. No one dropped a pen. But everyone became still. I heard the sentence for what it was. So did Claire. Probably Robert. I looked at Patricia. You wouldn't be asking me as your daughter. Her eyes narrowed. You'd be asking the rights holder. That is exactly what you don't understand. What don't I understand? Families do not operate like licensing departments. This one apparently should have. Brittany shifted in her chair. Can we not do this? Patricia ignored her. Your grandmother built this company. I know. She built those designs here. The E-Series schedule says these remained hers. Paper. Yes. Always paper with you. Paper is useful when people remember history differently. Patricia laughed without humor. You walked away from this business and now you want the people who stayed to come to you like tenants. No. I want a company using assets I own to sign a license. If the company were owned by strangers, you would understand that immediately. That is precisely the difference. Helen's lawyer cleared his throat. From the buyer's perspective, the family relationship does not alter the rights issue. Patricia's face hardened. There it was. The thing she hated most. Not the royalty. Not the upfront fee. Not the archive moving. A stranger had just said that being my mother did not give her special commercial rights. Robert looked at Patricia. The numbers work. She turned on him. That is not the point. I almost said. Finally. Instead, I let the sentence sit. Robert tried again. We can absorb the fee. If Helen resumes the order at the projected range, the royalty is manageable. Robert, this resolves the problem. No, it creates a new one. What new problem? Brittany asked. Patricia looked at me. She gets veto power over our use of Evelyn. Only the E-Series material, company counsel said. She decides. I decide whether my rights are licensed for a specific use. Patricia turned back to him. I want that clause removed. Claire answered. Then Lauren would be granting unrestricted future use. That is what licensing should do. No, Claire said. That is what ownership transfer would do. Lauren is not selling the archive. My mother looked at me again. So that's it? That's what? You get to sit outside the company and approve what we do with my mother. I felt anger rising, but something else rose with it. Clarity. This is not about the money for you. Patricia's expression changed. I never said it was. No, you said the company needed saving. It does. Then here is a path where you control us, a path where I control what belongs to me. She pushed the document away. No. Robert stared at her. Patricia. No. Helen Price spoke from the screen. If there is no license, I cannot move forward with this collection as currently presented. My mother looked at her. We'll restructure the material. That is your choice. Helen did not sound angry. That made the consequence worse. The meeting ended without a signature. No one stormed out. Patricia gathered her papers. Robert remained seated. Brittany looked from one parent to the other, as if she had walked into a different family halfway through the afternoon. Claire and I packed slowly. Outside the conference room, I expected relief. Instead, I felt tired. For weeks, my mother had said this was about jobs. The company. Grandma. Duty. Now she had been given terms company counsel considered workable, Robert considered financially manageable, and the buyer was willing to accept. Patricia had rejected them because I retained authority over my own archive. That did not prove every choice she had made was driven by control. It proved control mattered enough to jeopardize the solution she claimed to want. Brittany caught me near the elevator. Lorraine. Claire glanced at me. I'll wait downstairs. When she left, Brittany held out a small cream envelope. What is that? Something you should see. I did not take it immediately. From who? Grandma. That got my attention. I took the envelope. Inside was a small card in Evelyn's handwriting. No legal formatting. No dates that mattered at first glance. Just a few lines. The sentence in the middle was the one Brittany wanted me to see. One day I hope Brittany wears my work proudly. I read it twice. My chest tightened. Where did you get this? I've had it for years. What is it from? Does it matter? Yes. Of course it does to you. I looked up. Brittany's eyes were red, but she was not crying. You keep acting like Grandma chose you and rejected me. I have never said that. You don't have to. I'm talking about ownership. You're always talking about ownership because ownership is the version where you win. The words landed harder than I wanted them to. Brittany pointed toward the card. She wanted me involved. That's not the same as… I know. Not the same as a contract. Not the same as a copyright schedule. Not the same as whatever Claire would call it. I stopped. Because for the first time since Megan sent the photograph, Brittany had handed me something authentic that did not fit neatly into the story I had been telling myself. Not a rumor. Not Patricia's interpretation. Grandma's handwriting. I looked again at the sentence. One day I hope Brittany wears my work proudly. I could have dismissed it. I wanted to. Instead, I put the card carefully back into its envelope. Can I keep this overnight? Brittany hesitated, then nodded. Don't lose it. I won't. I stepped into the elevator with Grandma's card in my hand, and a feeling I did not like at all. Up to that point, every new piece of evidence had made the shape of what happened clearer. This one did the opposite, and if I expected Patricia and Brittany to accept documents that hurt their version of the truth, I had to be willing to do the same when the document hurt mine. I did not sleep well with Grandma's card sitting on my nightstand. It bothered me for a reason I did not want to admit. If the card had looked suspicious, I could have dismissed it. If the handwriting had been wrong, if the paper had been new, if Brittany had claimed Grandma wrote it the week before she died, I would have known exactly what to do. Instead, the card looked real. The looping capital B in Brittany's name was Grandma's. So was the way she crossed a T too far to the right and left the tail of her Y hanging lower than the line beneath it. I had seen those habits on birthday cards, invoices, notes taped to fabric bolts, and the handwritten labels that still existed on half the archive. The problem was not whether Grandma wrote it. The problem was what she meant. One day, I hope Brittany wears my work proudly. I read the sentence again before breakfast. Adam sat across from me at the kitchen table, eating toast and pretending not to watch. You want me to say something? No. Excellent. I'm very good at that. I looked up. He took another bite. I hate this card. That seems unfair to the card. I hate what it might mean. That sounds more accurate. I slid it across the table. Read it. I already did. Read it again. He did. Then he handed it back. What do you think? I think your grandmother hoped Brittany would wear her work proudly. That's all? That is literally what the sentence says. I frowned. You're no help. I am tremendous help. You just want me to interpret handwriting in a way that makes you comfortable. He was right. That irritated me enough to make the coffee taste worse. I called Martin at 8:30. Please tell me you recognize this card, I said after sending him a photograph. He took a minute. I recognize the handwriting. So do I. Where did it come from? Brittany. That does not answer the question. I smiled despite myself. Apparently, I was not the only person in the story who repeated questions until people answered them. She says she's had it for years. Martin asked me to give him an hour. 43 minutes later, he called back. I found a reference. To the card? To a box containing charity event material. Evelyn kept old invitations, programs, press clippings, notes. This card was listed inside one of those boxes when we inventoried the memorabilia. What year? 2014. I sat straighter. The backstage photograph I had seen while searching my cloud folder came back immediately. Brittany at 20. One of Grandma's gowns. The charity runway. Can I see the inventory page? Yes. And the box? It's still with the estate memorabilia pending family distribution. There's nothing legally significant about it, but we can inspect the contents. I'm not trying to make it legally significant. I know. I paused. I'm trying to understand what Grandma meant. Martin's voice softened. That may be harder. By noon, Denise had filled in the rest. She remembered the event immediately. Of course I do, she said. Brittany almost backed out. That was not what I expected. Brittany? She was terrified. I have never seen Brittany terrified of a camera. She wasn't afraid of the camera, she was afraid of the gown. I frowned. What does that mean? It was one of Evelyn's more complicated pieces. Structured bodice, handwork through the skirt, fragile trim at the shoulder. Brittany thought she would ruin it. I pictured my sister at 20, standing backstage with the confidence I had always associated with her. She looked fine in the photograph. She was fine once she got on the runway. Denise laughed. Actually, she was better than fine. She saved the whole thing. How? One of the donors was supposed to speak during the presentation and froze. Brittany stepped in. Talked about the dress, talked to the guests, made them laugh. She sold 3 auction packages afterward. I leaned back. That sounded exactly like Brittany. Grandma was impressed? Very. What did she say? Denise was quiet for a second. I remember something about you two. I waited. Evelyn said you understood how things were made. Brittany understood how to make people look at them. My throat tightened. Those exact words? Close. It was 12 years ago, Lauren. Right. Why? I looked at Grandma's card on the table. No reason. Denise snorted. You inherited that from Patricia. What? Answering a question by pretending there isn't one. I told her about the card. Denise went quiet. Then she said, That sounds right. What sounds right? Evelyn writing that after the runway. So she wanted Brittany to inherit the designs? I did not say that. I know. Do you? I rubbed my forehead. I'm trying. Denise's voice softened. Your grandmother never talked about either of you like there could only be one useful granddaughter. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because it accused me. Because it exposed something. For weeks, I had been furious at Patricia for turning Grandma's legacy into a competition. Lauren left. Brittany stayed. Lauren has paperwork. Brittany earned the legacy. Lauren protects old things. Brittany carries them forward. I had recognized how manipulative those divisions were when my mother used them. I had not recognized how often I had created my own version. I understood the work. Brittany understood attention. I had treated the first as substance and the second as decoration. Maybe because Grandma and I had shared the first. That afternoon, Martin arranged access to the charity memorabilia box. I met him in a small conference room near his office. The box contained exactly what he had described. A printed invitation, an old event program, several photographs, a newspaper clipping, a page of handwritten notes, no secret amendment to a will, no hidden inheritance instructions, no dramatic confession from Grandma, just context. I found Brittany's name in the program, model and guest presenter. There was a photograph of her on the runway, smiling at a room full of donors. Another showed Grandma backstage, with one hand on Brittany's shoulder. The card had been tucked into the program. Martin watched me read it again. You disappointed? I don't know. That's an interesting answer. I wanted it to mean something simple. Most family documents don't. I put the card down. It doesn't transfer anything. No. It doesn't say Brittany owns the designs. No. It doesn't say Grandma wanted her to run the company. No. But it does say Grandma valued something Brittany did. Yes. I nodded. That matters. Martin looked surprised. So what are you going to do? Give it back. To Brittany? It's hers. That evening, I called my sister. She answered cautiously. You finished investigating my birthday card? It wasn't a birthday card. Charity card. Yes. So? So, Grandma wrote it after the runway. Silence. I told you it was real. I never said it wasn't. You didn't believe what it meant. I still don't think it means what Mom used it to mean. What does that mean? I sat at my studio work table with the card sealed in a clean, protective sleeve. Grandma didn't write that you owned her archive. I know. She didn't write that you were her creative successor. I know. She did think you were good at what you did. Brittany was quiet. I continued before I could lose my nerve. You are good at what you do. Wow. Don't make this unbearable. No, please. I want to enjoy it. Brittany, I'm listening. I took a breath. You're good at selling. You're good with clients. You know how to present something. You always did. And you thought that was shallow? Yes. There was a long pause. I forced myself not to fill it. Finally, Brittany said, That's the first honest thing you've said to me in years. That's dramatic. See? There you are. I'm trying. So am I. That was the first time I had heard her say it. I looked at the old event photograph on my laptop. I made what you're good at sound smaller because it wasn't what Grandma and I shared. Brittany did not answer immediately. When she did, the sharpness had gone out of her voice. She liked working with you more. I don't know if that's true. It was. Maybe. Thank you for not pretending. I smiled despite myself. But this does not change the archive. Her sigh came back immediately. There it is. I meant what I said about your ability. I also mean this. Of course, being good at selling Grandma's work does not make the work yours. I know. Do you? Yes. I heard something. In the answer I had not heard before. Not agreement exactly. Tiredness. Maybe embarrassment. I decided not to push. I'll return the card. Keep it until we deal with the necklace. I sat straighter. What about the necklace? Brittany went quiet again. That silence had become recognizable. Not ignorance. Calculation. What? Mom told me Martin was looking into how it got out. He is. I know. How? Because the stylist called me. My pulse quickened. What stylist? Celia. She handled my hair and accessories that night. What did she say? That she got an email from Martin's office asking about the necklace box. I stood. Why would Martin contact her without telling me? Maybe because he's investigating. That was fair. I hated that too. Brittany, what happened with the necklace? I told you. You told me Mom said the estate hadn't finished distributing it. That is what she said. How did the necklace physically get to you? Mom gave it to Celia. In what? A box. What kind of box? I don't know. Was it sealed? Another silence. My stomach dropped. Brittany. Yes. Yes, what? There was some kind of numbered strip across it. I sat back down. Did Celia cut it? I think so. You think? I was getting dressed. There were 5 people around me. Mom handed her the box. Celia opened it. You saw the seal. Yes. Did you ask why an estate box was sealed? No. Why not? Because Mom said it was fine. The old answer. Legal was handled. Mom said it was fine. Family can use it. I closed my eyes. Did you know it had been left to me? Yes. Then why didn't you ask Martin? I didn't want to. The honesty was so sudden that I said nothing. Brittany continued. I knew there was a chance he would say no. There it was. Not confusion. Choice. I wanted the necklace in the photographs, she said. Why? You know why. Say it. Because it made the collection look connected to Grandma. I stared at the wall. You knew exactly what it was doing. I knew what the picture looked like. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. It's close enough. She sounded angry again. At least I'm telling you. That doesn't erase it. I know. This time, I believed her. Does Ryan know? Yes. That answered another question I had not planned to ask. What did he say? He said I should give it back. He sat still. So why haven't you? Another pause. I don't know. That was probably the least flattering, honest answer she could have given. It was also the most believable. Bring it to my studio tomorrow. Lorraine. Tomorrow. Can't Martin handle it? He can document the handoff if needed. I want it returned. I'll bring it. After we hung up, I called Martin. He confirmed he had already located the box photographs from the original inventory. The box had a numbered tamper-evident seal. He had also obtained an email from Celia, the stylist. Patricia had told her the jewelry was an estate family piece approved for continuity photographs. Approved by whom? I asked. She didn't say. Did Celia ask? No. Did Celia know it was specifically left to me? According to her, no. Then she's not the problem. I agree. What about safe access? We know Patricia had authorized building access. The estate box was stored in the fire, rated safe under the temporary custody arrangement. We're still documenting exactly when it was removed. Can that get her arrested? Martin paused. I thought you didn't want television law. I don't. I'm asking. Unauthorized handling is serious. Whether anyone treats it criminally depends on facts and intent. Right now, it is more useful as evidence that Patricia knew estate property was controlled and used it anyway. That made sense. It was also enough. I did not need handcuffs. I needed the truth to stop moving every time Patricia touched it. The next afternoon, Brittany came to my studio. She arrived alone. No Patricia. No Ryan. No lawyer. She carried a small gray jewelry box inside a clear protective bag Martin had provided after documenting it. I could see where the original seal had been cut. She set it on my work table. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Brittany said, "I should have asked you." I looked at her. Yes. She flinched slightly. Maybe she expected me to soften the answer. I did not. "I knew it was meant for you," she said. "I told myself one night didn't matter. It mattered because you knew asking might stop you." "I know." I opened the protective bag carefully. Inside, the necklace looked smaller than it had in the photographs. Pearls. White gold flowers. The repaired clasp. No magical glow. No victory music. Just an object Grandma had once put around my neck while I wore a sweatshirt. I checked the clasp automatically. Habit. The repair still held. Brittany watched. "Are you going to wear it?" I closed the box. "Not yet." "Why?" I thought about the photographs from the party. About Grandma's name behind Brittany. About all the meanings Patricia had forced onto the necklace in one evening. Because right now, it still feels like evidence. Brittany looked down. "That makes sense." I slid Grandma's charity card toward her. "It's yours." She picked it up. "You kept it in a sleeve." "I'm a conservator." I know. For the first time in months, that sentence did not sound like an insult. She turned toward the door, then stopped. "Mom didn't choose me because she thinks I'm stupid. I never said she did. You think she controls me. I think she knows what you want." "What do I want?" "To be taken seriously." Brittany looked at me for a long moment. "And what do you want? Right now?" "Yes." I looked at the necklace box. "For people to stop calling ownership a personality defect." She almost smiled. Then she left. 2 days later, Helen Price asked for a private video call with Claire and me. I assumed she wanted to discuss the stalled Davis bridal proposal. Instead, Helen opened with something I had not expected. "I want to separate the archive from the manufacturer for a moment." Claire looked at me. I said, "Okay." Helen continued. "Our interest in the collection was based on access to authentic Evelyn material. Davis Bridal was the proposed manufacturing partner because of its history and existing capacity. Was? Is? Potentially. That word mattered. Helen folded her hands. "But the rights travel with you." I felt something shift. Claire said, "What are you proposing? If Lauren controls the E-Series rights, we can license directly from her and place production with another qualified manufacturer." I stared at the screen. "You would bypass Davis Bridal. If necessary." The sentence was calm, commercial, almost ordinary. That made it more powerful. "What happens to their order?" I asked. "It would no longer be their order." I leaned back. For weeks, Patricia had told everyone the company needed Helen Price. I had assumed that meant Helen needed Davis Bridal House too. Apparently not. Helen continued. "We would still require attribution, provenance review, production standards, and a manufacturing partner capable of handling the work. But from a rights perspective, we do not need Davis Bridal House if we can contract with you." Claire asked the questions I was temporarily incapable of asking. Scope, term, royalties, manufacturing options, approval, marketing. Helen had thought about all of it. By the end of the call, I understood exactly what she was offering. More control, higher royalty participation. No Patricia, no Robert, no Brittany. No need to negotiate with people who had spent months explaining why asking me was inconvenient. When the screen went dark, Claire stayed on the call. "You're smiling. I know. That worries me." "It shouldn't." "It absolutely should." I stood and walked toward the window. Outside my studio, late afternoon traffic moved slowly down the street. They missed my wedding for this deal. Yes. They used Grandma's archive for it. Yes. They told the whole family I was putting jobs at risk. Yes. And now Helen is telling me I can take the deal away from them. Yes. I turned. Tell me that isn't satisfying. Claire's expression remained neutral. I'm not paid to lie. I laughed. For the first time since the wedding, revenge did not look like a lawsuit. It looked like a contract, a clean one, a profitable one that did not require my mother's permission for anything. I wish I could tell you I rejected the idea immediately because I was too wise to enjoy it. I did not. I asked Claire to send me the framework. Claire sent the direct license framework before I left the studio that evening, and I read it 3 times before I drove home. The numbers were better than anything Davis Bridal House had offered because there would be one less commercial layer between the archive and the retailer. Helen's company would license defined E-Series artwork directly from me, pay an upfront fee, and give me a larger royalty percentage on units sold. A separate manufacturing partner would handle production under quality standards reviewed in advance. I would still approve which archival works could be used, but I would not be responsible for running a factory, sourcing every yard of fabric, or pretending I suddenly knew more about wholesale manufacturing than people who had spent their careers doing it. It was a good deal. That was the problem. For several minutes, I sat at my work table imagining my mother hearing about it. I pictured Patricia receiving a polite email from Helen, explaining that the retailer had decided to pursue another manufacturing route. I pictured the collection she had built an entire engagement party around appearing in stores anyway, except Davis Bridal House would no longer be part of it. Grandma's name would remain. The artwork would remain. I would remain. Patricia would be the only unnecessary element. The image satisfied something in me that had been hungry since the wedding. I called Claire. Draft it. You read the framework? Yes. All of it? Yes. Questions? Plenty. Then why did you say draft it before asking any of them? Because I want to know what the real version looks like. Claire was silent for a moment. Exploratory only. Fine. No acceptance. No promises to Helen. No production commitments. I know. And before you accuse me of treating you like a child, I'm saying this because the commercial structure will matter if you later decide Davis Bridal gets another opportunity. I'm not sure they deserve another opportunity. That wasn't the question. I leaned back in my chair. What was? Whether giving them one produces a better outcome for you? I looked at the photograph of the necklace that still sat inside my evidence folder. I'll think about it. Good. But draft the direct option. I will. When I got home, Adam was in the kitchen chopping onions with the concentration of a surgeon. He had learned early in our relationship that cooking was one of the few domestic activities I approached with complete indifference, which meant he could do almost anything, as long as he did not ask me to appreciate the knife technique. How was your day? He asked. Helen wants to bypass Davis Bridal. The knife stopped. That escalated. She can license the archive directly from me and use another manufacturer. Can she? Apparently. He put the knife down and washed his hands. And you want to? I opened the refrigerator. There's a good economic case. That isn't what I said. I pulled out a bottle of water. It pays more. Still not what I said. The retailer gets clean rights. Lorraine. I closed the refrigerator. Yes, I want to. Adam leaned against the counter. Because it's a better deal? Yes. Only because it's a better deal? I hated how quickly my answer disappeared. He waited. I twisted the cap off the bottle. Do you know what they did for that order? Yes. They missed our wedding. I remember. They used Grandma's archive. Yes. They put Brittany in the necklace and told everyone I was threatening 30 jobs. Yes. And now the buyer is telling me Patricia isn't necessary. Adam nodded. That feels good. It feels excellent. I can see that. Then why are you making that face? What face? The one where you're about to ask something irritating. He smiled slightly. If another manufacturer is better for Evelyn's work, use them. Okay. If they can produce better quality, protect the archive better, pay you fairly, and give the retailer what it needs, I don't see a problem. I waited. He continued. But if they're better because your mother would hate watching someone else make the collection, say that to yourself before you sign anything. I stared at him. There it is. What? The irritating question. I thought it was more of an irritating statement. I know the difference. I married a specialist. I walked past him toward the dining table. You think I'm being vindictive. I think you are entitled to be vindictive in your head. That is very generous. I also think you've spent 3 months making careful decisions because your mother keeps confusing what she wants with what she's entitled to. I stopped. Adam picked up the knife again. It would be unfortunate if you started doing the same thing now that the decision favors you. I wanted to argue. Instead, I sat down. The problem with marrying someone who does not tell you what you want to hear is that occasionally you have to live with the consequences. Claire's exploratory draft arrived 2 days later. I read every clause. The economics were genuinely attractive. Helen's company would pay me more than Davis Bridal could reasonably pay because the outside manufacturer had a simpler cost structure and no retail showroom debt. They also proposed using my conservation studio as a consulting source for archive interpretation, which would create another paid role separate from the license. It was not a revenge fantasy disguised as business. It was a legitimate option. That made the decision harder, not easier. Before I answered Helen, Martin asked me to attend another archive inspection. The independent storage facility we were considering needed measurements, environmental records, and an updated item count before they could quote long-term custody. I met Martin and the archivist at Davis Bridal on a Monday morning. Production was active again, but only on ordinary company collections. Under the standstill, no new E-Series work could move forward. I passed through the alterations department and saw 3 women bent over gowns under bright task lights. Rosa was pinning a sleeve, while another seamstress hand-finished beadwork nearby. There was something Grandma had always understood that I sometimes forgot. Craft did not happen in concepts. It happened through people's hands. I had spent weeks saying Davis Bridal House, as if it were Patricia. It wasn't. Patricia controlled it. Robert financed it. Brittany sold for it. But other people made the actual work. Rosa looked up. You back to steal more boxes? They're mine. So yes. I smiled. Possibly. She nodded toward the back work table. Come look at this, before you disappear into your paperwork. I followed her. A young seamstress named Lila was finishing hand-applied lace on a bodice. She had joined Davis Bridal after I left, so I knew her only by name. Rosa pointed to the stitching. Your grandmother taught me that placement. I taught her. Lila looked embarrassed to be discussed. It's not perfect. It isn't supposed to be perfect yet, Rosa said. That's why you're still holding the needle. I ran my eyes over the work without touching it. It was good. Not because it looked old, because it respected the method without turning the garment into a museum piece. Who designed this one? I asked. Regular spring collection, Rosa said. Nothing's from the E-Series. I nodded. Lila glanced between us. Are we going to lose the price order? Rosa gave her a warning look. It's okay, I said. I don't know. Lila flushed. Sorry. You don't need to apologize. She put the needle down carefully. My husband says I should start applying somewhere else. That hit harder than a speech about mortgages would have. Not because I suddenly felt responsible for her job. I didn't. But she was real. A person whose name I now knew. Sitting in front of me with a needle in her hand. What did management tell you? I asked. That they're negotiating. That's true. Is the company closing? No. Her shoulders loosened slightly. I can't promise what happens with staffing, I added. But nobody has told me the company is closing. Rosa watched me. When Lila returned to the gown, Rosa led me toward the hallway. You didn't owe her that. I know. You're thinking about something. Apparently everyone can tell now. You always look at the left corner of the ceiling when you're arguing with yourself. I looked up involuntarily. Rosa laughed. I hate you. No, you don't. I glanced back at the workroom. There's another manufacturer interested. Rosa's expression changed. For Evelyn's collection? Yes. And you control that? Yes. Would they be good? I don't know yet. Then find out. That's very helpful. You want me to tell you to save this place because I've worked here forever? No. Good. I'm not going to. She crossed her arms. But don't assume a new factory understands Evelyn because they can reproduce a scan. There are people in this building who learned why she made certain choices. That sounds like an argument for staying. It's an argument for knowing what you're trading. That was different. I looked toward the workroom again. Grandma had trained some of those people herself. Not all. Not enough to make Davis Bridal irreplaceable, but enough that the company had something the outside manufacturer did not: continuity of technique. That mattered to the archive. It also mattered commercially. I called Claire from the parking lot. I don't want to reject the outside deal. Okay, but I don't want to accept it yet. Also, okay, I want Davis Bridal to get one more chance. There was a pause. Why? Because if they can meet market terms, keeping production with people who know Grandma's methods may actually be better for the work. Only reason? No. Good. I also don't want 6 people losing jobs because I was angry enough to choose a perfectly viable but more destructive option. Claire did not say anything. That does not mean I'm responsible for saving their jobs. I didn't say it did. I'm saying it for me. Then keep going. I want the outside offer as the fallback. Your BATNA. I know what BATNA means. I was making sure. Best alternative to a negotiated agreement. I'm proud of you. Please stop. She laughed. What do you want changed in the Davis Bridal proposal? Nothing softer. Good. Market rate. Yes. Same archive control. Yes. Independent storage. Yes. Correct attribution. Yes. And a deadline tied to Helen's buying schedule. I'm not leaving this open forever. That's sensible. If Patricia refuses, I take the outside route. Then we have a real negotiation. The revised proposal went out the following week. This time, there was no ambiguity about the alternative. Claire informed company counsel that another qualified manufacturing route existed and that Lauren Davis was willing to give Davis Bridal House the first opportunity to license the E-Series on commercially reasonable terms because of its historic production connection to Evelyn's work. Patricia hated that sentence. I knew, because she called me. You're threatening us with another manufacturer. I'm giving Davis Bridal first opportunity. You're holding a knife behind your back while pretending to shake hands. If you don't want the license, I'm not obligated to leave the archive unused forever. You would take my mother's work to strangers. Your mother's work is already with me. That is not what I meant. I know. Those people don't know how she worked. Some of them don't. And you don't care. I care enough to give Davis Bridal the first chance. For a fee. Yes. You really can't hear yourself. I hear myself clearly. Your grandmother would be disgusted. That sentence used to have power. It did not anymore. You don't get to make Grandma testify because she's dead. Patricia hung up. The formal meeting happened in early March. This time, Helen Price joined for the entire negotiation because the retailer had set a deadline for resolving sourcing. Company counsel was present. Claire was beside me. Robert sat across the table. Brittany came in last and took a chair near the end, dressed more simply than usual. Patricia entered without looking at me. The revised license sat in front of everyone. Company counsel began. The financial terms are within the range discussed previously. Buyer counsel has confirmed they can proceed with due diligence if the rights package is executed by the deadline. Robert flipped to the royalty schedule. We can work with this. Patricia said nothing. Helen's face appeared on the monitor. From our perspective, continuity with the existing production team is preferable if rights and governance are clear. We are not requiring Davis Bridal as manufacturer, but we are willing to proceed with Davis Bridal under this structure. That was the most generous statement Patricia was going to receive. Company counsel turned to her. We've narrowed Lauren's approval to specific uses of E-Series source artwork. She does not control design decisions unrelated to that archive. Patricia opened the agreement. Remove it. Claire did not react. Company counsel said, Which provision? You know which one. He waited anyway. Patricia placed a finger on the paragraph. Final approval. Claire answered. That stays. No. It is the mechanism that prevents unauthorized future use. We will comply with the schedule. Compliance requires someone to determine whether a proposed source is within the license. Our creative team can determine that. Your creative team used E-Series scans without a license. Patricia looked at me. There. That tone. I folded my hands. Which tone? The one where you treat this company like a thief. I did not answer immediately. Then I said, I'm treating it like a company that needs a contract. Robert intervened. Patricia, we've been through this. No, you've surrendered to it. The numbers work. I am not talking about numbers. Brittany looked up. What are you talking about? Patricia ignored her. Company counsel spoke carefully. If the approval provision is removed entirely, Lauren is effectively granting us broader continuing access to E-Series material without project-specific authorization. Her counsel has made clear that is not available. Patricia turned to Claire. What if we remove the E-Series entirely? Helen answered before Claire could. Then the proposed order changes materially. Patricia looked toward the screen. How materially? We would evaluate the remaining collection as a standard Davis bridal line. The Evelyn archive is a substantial part of the commercial proposition. So you reduce the order? Yes. How much? We would need revised projections. Robert's face tightened. Everyone at the table understood what that meant. Smaller deposit, less committed revenue, less leverage with the lender. Patricia looked at the agreement again. I thought, for one moment, she might sign. Instead, she pushed it toward company counsel. Remove Lauren's final approval and come back to me. He did not touch the document. We cannot do that without her agreement. Then find another structure. There isn't another structure that gives the company unilateral use of rights it does not own. Patricia's face changed. Not anger exactly. Humiliation. She looked at me. You enjoy this. No. Don't, Lee. I enjoy being asked now instead of ignored. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. She stood. Robert stared at her. Sit down. Patricia looked at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Excuse me? We have a workable deal. A deal where Lauren sits above the company. No, I said, I sit beside my property. Stop. I'm not doing anything. That's the problem. You act like this is objective. Ownership is objective. Family isn't. Brittany put both hands flat on the table. Mom. Patricia looked at her. Brittany's voice was quieter than I had ever heard it in a business meeting. You said this was about saving the company. It is. Then sign it. Patricia froze. So did I. Brittany continued. The buyer stays, the collection stays, the production team stays, we pay Lauren, we credit Grandma correctly. What exactly are you refusing? Patricia stared at her younger daughter. For the first time, I saw Brittany on the wrong side of Patricia's control. Not because she had suddenly become loyal to me. Because the facts no longer supported the story she had been given. Patricia said, You don't understand what this does. What does it do? It puts Lauren in control. Of the archive. That is enough. Brittany leaned back. There was a long silence. Then she said, So, this isn't just about the company. Patricia gathered her papers. I am not discussing family dynamics in front of a buyer. Helen's expression did not change. Neither did her lawyers. That probably made it worse. Patricia left the room. Nobody followed immediately. Robert pressed 2 fingers against his forehead. Company counsel looked down at the unsigned agreement. Helen waited. Finally, Robert said, Give us 48 hours. Helen nodded. After that, I need a manufacturing direction. The call ended. I stood to leave. Brittany remained seated. She looked at the doorway Patricia had disappeared through, then at me. I could see questions on her face, but I did not pretend to know which ones. I packed my papers. Claire and I were halfway to the lobby when company counsel caught us. Lauren. We stopped. He looked uncomfortable. That was unusual. What? I want you to hear this from me before it reaches you indirectly. Claire immediately became more attentive. He continued. Helen's counsel has raised concerns beyond the rights dispute. They want assurance that whoever signs the revised agreement can actually keep the company compliant with it, because Patricia keeps rejecting the approval structure. Yes, Claire asked. Anything from the lender? He nodded. Our bank has already been reviewing the working capital line. They are not calling anything. They are not dictating management. But they have indicated that further flexibility will depend partly on the company demonstrating corrective governance after the rights issue. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. It means the board is meeting. Because the buyer ordered them to? No. Because we may lose the buyer and lender flexibility if we don't resolve management risk. I felt a slow, cold understanding settle in. Up to that moment, every consequence had been attached to the archive. Use it without permission. lose access. Fail to secure a license, lose the order. But Patricia had kept pushing beyond the original problem. She had been given a path to clean rights. She refused. Given a path to preserve production. She refused. Given a path that company counsel, Robert, and the buyer all considered commercially workable. Still no. Not because the company could not afford it. Because she could not tolerate the person whose permission it required. Claire asked, "When is the board meeting?" "Tomorrow afternoon." "Who called it?" "The independent directors requested it after counsel circulated the buyer and lender concerns." He glanced at me. "Patricia owns 40% of the voting shares. She is the largest individual shareholder. But she does not control the board alone." I knew the ownership structure, but hearing it at that moment made the situation feel different. What are they deciding? He chose his words carefully. Whether current operational leadership is creating an unacceptable risk to the company. I looked back through the glass doors toward the conference room. For months, Patricia had accused me of endangering Davis Bridal House. Now the buyer had an available license. The company had an available manufacturer. The employees had a path to keep working. And the person standing between the business and that solution was no longer me. It was my mother. Claire touched my arm lightly. "We should go." I nodded. Outside, the afternoon air was warmer than I expected. I stood on the sidewalk while Claire unlocked her car. "When this started," I said, "I thought the worst thing Mom could lose was Helen's order." Claire looked at me. "And now?" I glanced back at the building Grandma had founded, and Patricia had spent most of her adult life running. Now the board has to decide whether she's safe to leave in charge. The board meeting happened the next afternoon, but I was not invited into the executive session. That mattered. By then, I had spent months learning the difference between what I wanted to know and what I had a right to know. Davis Bridal House was still a corporation. I owned archive rights, not a board seat. Patricia was still a 40% shareholder. Robert still held 35%. Brittany had 10. The employee ownership trust held the remaining 15. None of that made me entitled to sit behind a closed door, while directors decided whether my mother should remain president. What I was invited to was the transaction and governance meeting beforehand. Claire and I arrived 10 minutes early. Martin joined us because company counsel wanted the estate history summarized cleanly one last time. Helen Price and her lawyer were on video. Robert sat near the middle of the conference table. Brittany was beside him. Patricia entered last. She looked composed. That unsettled me more than anger would have. She wore a navy suit I had seen her use for lender meetings, interviews, and one funeral. Her hair was perfect. No visible panic, no red eyes. If you had walked into the room without context, you would have assumed she was the person there to solve the crisis rather than the person who had created most of it. Company counsel opened the meeting. "We are not here to relitigate every family disagreement." Patricia's mouth tightened. I almost smiled. He continued. "We are here because the buyer needs clean rights and confidence in performance. The lender has raised governance concerns, and the board needs a clear factual record before determining next steps." Helen nodded from the monitor. "For our purposes, we need 3 things: clean rights, accurate attribution, and assurance that whoever commits Davis Bridal House to those terms can and will honor them." Nobody looked at Patricia. That made it more obvious that everyone was thinking about her. Company counsel turned to Claire. "Let's keep this chronological." Claire looked at me. "You want to begin?" I had rehearsed the evidence twice. Not a speech. A sequence. That difference kept me calm. I opened the first document. In 2018, Evelyn Davis and Davis Bridal House signed an archive and creative rights schedule. I slid copies across the table. The agreement separated company-owned materials from Evelyn's private E-Series archive. Patricia said nothing. I continued. In September 2025, after Grandma died, the estate partially distributed the E-Series physical archive and the rights she still owned in those listed works to me. Martin confirmed the distribution date. Company counsel asked whether any relevant works at issue had previously been assigned back to Davis Bridal. Martin answered no, based on the estate and company records provided. I moved to the next item. These are my conservation photographs. I displayed E9, the dogwood branch, the same stain, the same sleeve code, then the prototype photograph from Brittany's engagement party. I did not say, "Look how obvious this is." I did not need to. Helen leaned closer to her screen. Claire spoke. The prototype arrangement tracks the E9 source artwork closely enough that the buyer's counsel requested source documentation. We then obtained the production scan package. Next document, E9, Dogwood, Rev 2, PDF. The file name Patricia had sent Denise. The date. The source package. Company counsel confirmed production received it through Patricia's email. Patricia finally spoke. I sent production files I was told were cleared. Claire turned toward her. Who told you? Patricia looked at company counsel. Legal was being handled. Company counsel did not rescue her. We did not issue an E-Series clearance before the party. Silence. Brittany stared at the table. I moved on. The event program. The buyer seating. The collection presentation. A photograph of Brittany wearing Grandma's necklace beneath the Evelyn Legacy Collection backdrop. Patricia gave a small, impatient exhale. This is theater. No, I said. Theater was the party. Her eyes snapped to mine. Company counsel intervened. Lauren, I'm finished. Claire took over. The necklace itself is not the core commercial rights issue. It matters because it shows how Evelyn continuity was intentionally presented. Martin then summarized the estate custody. The necklace had been inventoried. Sealed. Scheduled for later physical handoff to me. Patricia had building access. The stylist confirmed Patricia delivered the sealed estate box for the party and described it as approved for continuity photographs. The seal was cut. The necklace was worn, then later returned after the dispute began. Patricia leaned back. It was a family necklace used for one evening. Martin answered before I could. It was an estate asset specifically bequeathed to Lauren and not yet released for use. She was going to receive it anyway. That does not create permission retroactively. Martin's voice stayed mild. That was why he was effective. Patricia had spent her whole life winning arguments by making calm people angry. Martin simply refused to become angry. Company counsel nodded to Claire. Scheduling. Claire displayed the email chain. Helen Price's weekend availability. Friday evening. Saturday. The internal event planning. Then the email. Lauren's ceremony runs late afternoon. She'll be occupied, so keep the archive presentation focused and move Helen to the buyer dinner on schedule. Nobody in that room was seeing it for the first time except perhaps one of the independent directors sitting in for the pre-session discussion. Still, the words felt newly ugly projected on a conference room screen. Patricia looked at me. I knew you would turn that into something it wasn't. I met her eyes. What was it? Scheduling. Yes. She blinked. I continued. That's exactly what it was. Something in my answer irritated her more than accusation would have. I did not need to claim she hated me. The email said enough. My wedding had been a scheduling condition. My absence had been useful. Claire moved on. The buyer term sheet appeared next. Davis Bridal represented that it had, or prior to commercialization would secure, all necessary rights and licenses. Claire said, We are not presenting this as proof that Patricia falsely claimed rights at signing. The wording expressly allowed the company to secure them later. Helen's lawyer nodded. That is correct. Patricia looked almost relieved. Then Claire added, What it establishes is that clean rights were always a condition to commercialization. The relief vanished. Next came my first licensing offer. Upfront fee, market royalties, attribution, independent archive stewardship, limited approval over E-Series use. Company counsel confirmed the economics were workable. Robert confirmed the numbers were manageable. Helen confirmed the buyer would have resumed diligence. Then came Patricia's refusal. No drama. No interpretation. Just meeting notes and follow-up emails. Remove Lauren's final approval. Find another structure. We cannot operate with Lauren holding veto power over Evelyn material. Company counsel's response. Without Lauren's approval, Davis Bridal cannot use E-Series works owned by Lauren outside the scope of an agreed license. Then my revised offer. Same core protections. Davis Bridal given first opportunity before I pursued another manufacturer. Buyer willing to continue. Patricia refusing again. Remove it. Helen looked into the camera. For clarity, our concern is no longer whether a license is commercially possible. Everyone listened. It is. Patricia crossed her arms. Helen continued. Our concern is whether Davis Bridal can execute and honor one under current leadership. There it was. Not my accusation. The buyer's risk assessment. Patricia turned toward the screen. I have honored contracts for 30 years. Helen did not flinch. I am sure you have. But this contract requires accepting Lauren's control over specified archival rights. You have twice rejected that structure after your own counsel advised that it was necessary. I rejected unnecessary control. Helen's lawyer said, From our side, it is not unnecessary. Patricia's voice sharpened. You are buying gowns, not deciding how a family manages its history. Helen answered, I am deciding whether my company should enter a commercial relationship, where ownership and authority are disputed inside the supplier's leadership. Patricia went still. That was probably the first time someone outside the family had described the problem in a way she could not dismiss as emotion. Robert cleared his throat. I think we need to be practical. Patricia turned toward him. We have been practical. The terms work. The buyer is here. The production team can do the work. The lender wants stability. I am aware. Then sign the license. She stared at him. The same look she had given Brittany the day before. Robert did not back down. Patricia said, So now you're comfortable putting Lauren above this company. No one is putting Lauren above the company. She has approval. Over property that belongs to her. Patricia laughed softly. There it is. Robert's expression changed. What? The part none of you understand. Evelyn did not build this so one granddaughter could sit outside it and charge the rest of us for permission. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger. Recognition. This was the argument beneath every argument. Not law. Not money. Not even jobs. Deserving. Patricia had decided who deserved Grandma's work. Once she did that, every document became an inconvenience. I spoke carefully. Grandma built Davis Bridal House. She also chose to keep some work outside it. Patricia looked at me. You think she wanted this? I don't know what she would think about today. That has never stopped you before. I ignored the bait. I know what she signed. Paper. Yes. She shook her head. You hide behind documents because you don't understand loyalty. Loyalty to what? This family. I looked around the table. At Robert. At Brittany. At the buyer. At counsel. Then back at her. If this was about family, you could have called me. Patricia's expression hardened. If it was about the company, you could have licensed the work. She opened her mouth. I continued. If it was about employees, you could sign now. That stopped her. For a second, nobody moved. I did not raise my voice. What exactly is left? Patricia stared at me. You. There was the closest thing she ever came to saying it plainly. Not because I was evil. Not because I was incompetent. Because I existed in a position she could not control. I let the silence hold. Company counsel finally said, We need to move to the governance portion. Patricia looked away from me. Before the directors entered executive session, Helen's lawyer asked one final question. Why was Lauren not approached before the showcase? Company counsel did not answer. Patricia did not answer. Brittany looked toward Robert. My father sat very still. Then he said, Because we thought she'd walk away. I turned toward him. He did not look at me. Helen's lawyer asked, Walk away from what? The fight. Robert rubbed his thumb along the edge of his notebook. Lauren has always left when family conflict gets ugly. That was true. I had left dinners. Left arguments. Left Davis Bridal House. Left conversations once I knew nobody wanted understanding. Robert continued. We assumed she'd be angry. We assumed she'd distance herself. We thought the business would move forward anyway. My throat tightened. Not because it surprised me. Because it put language around a strategy I had not known was a strategy. They had not only bypassed my consent. They had counted on my personality to make the bypass permanent. I looked at my father. I walked away from arguments. He finally met my eyes. I know. I never gave away my rights. His face changed. I know that now. I wanted to hurt him with something sharper. Instead, I said, "You knew it then. You just thought I wouldn't enforce them." Robert looked down. Yes, that answer was worse and better than an excuse. At least it was true. The independent directors asked a few more questions. Not about my wedding. About process. Who approved the scans? Who knew the license had not been secured? Who signed off on the showcase? What counsel had advised? What Patricia rejected? What the company risked if the buyer moved production elsewhere? Then the board went into executive session. Claire, Martin, and I waited outside in a smaller conference room. We were not told who said what. We did not listen at the door. Nobody came out dramatically. I checked email twice. Claire reviewed the latest direct manufacturer framework. Martin drank bad office coffee and complained about it as if there were no corporate crisis 20 feet away. After 30 minutes, I said, "How long do these usually take?" Claire did not look up. Longer when someone wants the answer fast. That was useless. It was meant to be. I walked to the window. From that side of the building, I could see part of the production entrance. A delivery truck backed toward the loading area. 2 employees rolled racks inside. Life continuing underneath governance. The thing that bothered me most was that I did not feel victorious. I had expected vindication to feel warmer. Instead, I felt tired. Patricia was my mother. There was no version of the day where that fact became irrelevant. She had missed my wedding, used Grandma's archive, used Brittany's engagement, used the company's fear, used my habit of walking away. And even after all of that, a small part of me still wanted her to do one sane thing. Sign. Keep the company. Accept the boundary. Go home angry. That option still existed. That was what made everything afterward belong to her. The door opened almost 40 minutes later. Company counsel stepped in first. Robert followed. He looked as if he had aged 5 years since the morning. Patricia was not with them. Brittany came a few seconds later but stayed near the doorway. Claire closed her laptop. Company counsel sat down. The board has made several decisions. I waited. Patricia's being removed from the president and operational management role effective after a short transition. I inhaled slowly. Her shares? Unchanged. Board seat? Separate governance discussions will continue. Today's decision concerns officer authority and operational control. That was realistic. Messy. Incomplete. Exactly the kind of outcome real organizations produced. He continued. Her access to the E-Series archive is suspended immediately. Any future use will be governed through the independent stewardship structure if the license is executed. Claire asked, "Has the board authorized company counsel to finalize the revised agreement?" "Yes. Subject to final buyer terms, lender documentation, and Lauren's acceptance." Robert sat across from me. I looked at him. "Did you vote?" Company counsel intervened. "Board deliberations are confidential." I nodded. "Right." Robert still answered the part he could. "I support the decision." That told me enough. Brittany looked pale. "What happens to Mom now?" I asked. Company counsel said, "She remains a shareholder. She'll receive whatever rights and distributions attached to her shares. She is not being erased from the company, but she will no longer run day-to-day operations." That distinction mattered. I had never wanted a fantasy where Patricia woke up penniless because a lawyer waived a document. She still owned 40% of a real company. She still had wealth. She still had history there. She simply no longer had the authority to treat that history as if it belonged exclusively to her. "What about the buyer?" I asked. "Helen will maintain the revised offer window through the end of the week. And if I don't sign, then the board will evaluate other business options." I nodded. Company counsel stood. "I think that's enough for today." He and Martin left first. Claire stayed because she knew better. Robert lingered. I thought he might apologize again. Instead, he said, "Your mother is in her office." I waited. "She knows the decision. How did she take it?" Robert looked at me. "I don't think I should answer that for her. One correct decision." Finally, "Okay." He left. Brittany stayed near the doorway. She looked at me, then at Claire. "Are you going to sign?" "I haven't decided." "Why not?" "Because the company removing Mom doesn't automatically mean Davis Bridal is the best place for the archive." She nodded. Not happy, but she understood. Ryan says I should stay out of this part. That sounds wise. She almost smiled. Then she left too. Claire began gathering her things. We should go. I nodded. We made it as far as the hallway outside the conference room. Patricia was standing there. I had not heard her approach. She did not look broken. That would have been easier. She looked furious in the specific way someone looks when anger is the only thing holding humiliation together. Claire stopped. I can give you privacy. No, I said. Patricia's eyes stayed on me. Stay. Claire stayed. My mother looked at the folder in my hand. Congratulations. I did not answer. You finally got what you wanted. There were a dozen responses I could have given. I could have reminded her about my wedding, the necklace, the scans, the employees, the buyer, the board. Instead, I thought about the first license. The one Robert said worked. The one Helen would accept. The one that could have ended the dispute before governance became an issue. No, I said. Patricia's mouth tightened. I offered you what I wanted. She stared at me. A fair agreement. Her eyes flicked toward Claire, then back. This is what you chose instead. For the first time, Patricia had no immediate answer. That lasted only a second. You think this company survives without me? I hope it does. The answer surprised her. You hope? Yes. After everything, you still get to stand there and pretend you're being noble. I'm not pretending anything. You wanted me out. No? Liar. I shook my head. I wanted you to stop using what wasn't yours. You knew where this would lead. I knew where refusing could lead. That is the same thing. No, it isn't. Her face hardened. You'll understand when that company starts cutting people. If it does, I'll know exactly who had a workable deal in front of her and refused to sign it. Patricia's jaw clenched. That was crueler than I had intended. It was also true. She stepped closer. You think paper makes you powerful. No. What does then? I thought about that. Being willing to hear no. She stared at me. I continued. You weren't. Something changed in her face. Not understanding. Maybe recognition. Maybe only anger. I did not try to name it. Patricia turned and walked away. No security. No shouting. No applause. Just my mother walking down a hallway in the company she had run for most of my adult life. Carrying 40% ownership, and none of the authority she had assumed would always come with it. Claire waited until Patricia disappeared around the corner. That went better than expected. What were you expecting? I don't know. Furniture. I laughed for the first time that day. Then she held up the revised license. Now comes the part your mother can't decide for you. I looked at it. For months, I had focused on proving one thing. They could not use Grandma's work without my permission. I had proved it. The buyer knew. The company knew. The board knew. Even Patricia knew, whether she admitted it or not. But proving that I could say no did not answer the final question. Did I still want to say yes? Davis Bridal had people Grandma trained. It had techniques tied to her work. It had employees who had nothing to do with Patricia's choices. It also had debt, damaged trust, a smaller buyer opportunity, and a history I was not interested in rejoining. The outside manufacturer remained available, cleaner, more profitable for me, emotionally easier. I held both options in my hands as Claire and I walked toward the exit. Winning the right to choose turned out to be different from knowing what to choose. And that was the one decision nobody else could make for me. I signed the revised license 4 days after the board removed my mother from operational control. Not because Davis Bridal House deserved a favor. Not because Robert asked me to. Not because Brittany apologized. And definitely not because I suddenly believed family businesses should be protected from the consequences of family decisions. I signed because, after everything was stripped away, the wedding, the necklace, Patricia's pride, my anger, the buyer's leverage, the production team at Davis Bridal was still the best fit for Grandma's E-Series work under the terms I was willing to accept. That distinction mattered to me. The outside manufacturing offer remained real. Claire made sure of that. We had final numbers, production standards, timelines, and enough information to walk away if Davis Bridal tried to reopen negotiations by appealing to guilt. They did not. The company counsel who took over negotiations after Patricia stepped back was almost aggressively boring, which I came to appreciate. He did not say Grandma would have wanted anything. He did not ask me to think about family. He did not bring up my wedding. He asked whether the royalty base included returned inventory. Claire answered. He asked how often the independent archive steward would report usage. Claire answered. He asked whether the company could adapt scale and placement of approved motifs without requesting new permission every time. I answered. Yes, within the approved application range. If you move the design onto a completely different product or build a new commercial concept around it, you submit again. He nodded and wrote it down. That was what I had wanted from the beginning. Not obedience, not revenge, a process. The final agreement gave Davis Bridal a limited commercial license to specific E-Series works. I received an upfront payment, ongoing market rate royalties, reimbursement for reasonable legal and archival expenses, and audit rights tied to the licensed material. Grandma's original artwork had to be credited accurately. Where surviving artisans had contributed identifiable historical work to production techniques or samples, the company agreed to preserve those credits in archival and promotional materials when appropriate. Most importantly, the physical E-Series archive would no longer remain inside Davis Bridal House. An independent climate-controlled storage facility outside Savannah took custody under a formal stewardship arrangement. Future access had to be logged. No more family member walking into a room because they had a key. No more assumption that proximity created permission. My approval rights were narrow and deliberate. If Davis Bridal wanted to use a specific E-Series motif, they submitted the request. If they wanted to change fabric suppliers, I did not care. If they wanted to alter store displays unrelated to Grandma's archive, I did not care. If Brittany wanted to sell gowns, I did not care. My control ended exactly where my property ended. That was how I knew I had made a decision different from my mother's. Patricia had always expanded her authority until everything around her felt like something she should be allowed to decide. I had spent months making sure mine stopped at the line. Helen Price's company accepted the revised structure, but the original order did not survive intact. That was one of the consequences Patricia never managed to blame on anyone convincingly, though she tried. The delay had pushed the retailer deeper into its buying calendar. Some store allocations had already been shifted elsewhere. The uncertainty around production had also forced Helen's team to reduce its initial commitment. The final order was still meaningful, just smaller, enough to provide a deposit and committed revenue that helped Davis Bridal negotiate breathing room with its lender. Not enough to erase the company's other mistakes. Robert had warned Patricia for more than a year that the newer showroom was underperforming. After the revised numbers came in, the board stopped pretending optimism could pay rent. By early summer, that location was put up for sale. The company consolidated appointments back towards Savannah, reduced management overhead, cut several vacant positions instead of filling them, and reorganized production schedules around the smaller order. A few people still lost jobs. That part never became satisfying. I knew two of them casually. One had worked in visual merchandising at the underperforming location. Another had been hired during the expansion and did not have enough seniority to survive the restructuring. When I heard, I felt guilty for about 15 minutes. Then I forced myself to separate guilt from responsibility. The company had expanded too fast before I touched any of this. Patricia had created the unauthorized collection. She had delayed the clean licensing path. She had rejected a workable deal twice. By the time the board acted, the buyer opportunity was smaller. Those facts did not make layoffs pleasant. They did mean I was not required to pretend I had caused them simply because I had refused to surrender my rights to prevent them. Rosa called me after the showroom announcement. You heard? Yes. People are scared. I know. You're not responsible. That seems to be everyone's favorite sentence lately. Maybe because you keep trying to collect responsibilities that don't belong to you. I smiled. You've been talking to Adam. No, he sounds smart though. He's unbearable. Good. Then Rosa told me production staffing looked steadier than it had during winter because the revised order had finally given them a predictable schedule. That mattered. It did not erase what happened. It just proved there had been a middle path after all. Patricia had insisted for months that my choices were simple. Give the company what it wanted or hurt the employees. Support the family or betray Grandma. Stay quiet or destroy the business. In the end, none of those choices had been real. The company could pay for what it used. The archive could be protected. Employees could keep working. I could earn money from assets I owned. Patricia could have remained president. She simply had to accept that one category of decisions no longer belonged to her. That was the price she refused to pay. She remained a 40% shareholder. I want that clear because stories like this often become ridiculous at the end. One document appears. The villain suddenly loses the house, the bank accounts, the company, and somehow all the furniture before dinner. That did not happen. My mother still owned valuable equity. She still had money. She still had relationships in the bridal industry. Her name was still associated with Davis Bridal House. She was not ruined. She was restricted. For Patricia, I suspect that was worse. The board appointed an interim president while they searched for permanent operational leadership. Patricia kept whatever shareholder rights attached to her ownership, but she no longer signed vendor agreements, controlled production, negotiated buyer terms, or authorized access to Grandma's archive. The first time Davis Bridal submitted an E-Series request under the new system, it went to the independent steward. Not my mother. Not Brittany. Not even directly to me at first. The steward reviewed the source, confirmed it was within the license schedule, and sent me the approval packet electronically. I signed it in under 2 minutes. No drama. No phone call. No family meeting. That quiet email was one of the most satisfying things that happened all year. Patricia had spent months acting as if recognizing my authority would paralyze the company. Instead, the process worked exactly as designed. That summer, the archive itself was moved. I attended the transfer because I wanted to, not because I had to. Each E-Series box was checked against the inventory, packed for controlled transport, and logged into its new storage location. E9 came through my hands again. The dogwood drawing still had Grandma's faint tea stain in the corner. I looked at it for maybe 10 seconds before sealing the sleeve back into its transport container. That was all. The drawing had started this entire chain for me. By then, it felt like what it actually was. A drawing. Important. Valuable. Protected. But not responsible for what people had chosen to do around it. My father stepped down from the CFO role after the financial transition was stable. He called it retirement. I think it happened at least 2 years earlier than he planned. The board did not force him out the way it removed Patricia from operations. Robert had cooperated with the restructuring, and from what Claire and company counsel told me, the lender trusted him more than anyone else in the family by the end. He left because he was tired, and, I suspect, because staying would have required him to spend every day inside the consequences of decisions he had once described as practical. We had lunch about a month before his last day. Same diner where he had shown me the numbers. This time there was no legal pad. No summary sheet. He ordered pie before we even discussed anything serious. I should have come to your wedding, he said eventually. I took a sip of coffee. Yes. He nodded. I keep thinking there was some way to do both. There probably was. I should have insisted. Yes. He looked at me. You're not making this easy. I don't think easy would help either of us. He gave a tired smile. Fair. We sat quietly for a while. Then he said, I'm sorry. Not sorry about the timing. Not sorry things became complicated. Just sorry. I believed him. That did not restore what we had. I believe you're sorry, I said. That doesn't put us back where we were. His face tightened, but he nodded. I know. And that was where I left it. I did not cut him off completely. I did not invite him back into every part of my life either. He began calling occasionally without asking for anything. Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I did not. Trust returned in measurements too small to narrate dramatically. That felt more honest. Brittany's consequences were different. She resigned from the title Creative Director of the Evelyn Legacy Collection before the revised launch. The marketing materials were rewritten. No more language implying she had originated Grandma's archival motifs. No more visual storytelling designed to make people assume she was the sole creative heir to Evelyn. The new materials credited the artwork directly. Original archival artwork by Evelyn Davis. E-Series archive under independent stewardship. Licensed through Lauren Davis. Brittany hated that last line. She told me so. I look like I stole something. You used work without permission. That's not the same as stealing. Then the correction should make you feel better. She rolled her eyes. That was the most normal conversation we had had in months. She stayed at Davis Bridal. Not as Grandma's successor. As herself, Sales. Customer relationships. Brand presentation. The things she was actually good at. I learned later that Helen Price liked working with her. That irritated me for approximately 3 seconds before I remembered I had already admitted Brittany had talent. Personal growth is inconvenient that way. Ryan did not leave her. I was glad he did not. A dramatic breakup would have turned Brittany's consequences into something too easy for her to blame on the rest of us. Instead, he postponed their wedding planning. I only knew because Brittany told me one afternoon when she came by my studio to pick up the charity card Grandma had written. I had kept it in an archival sleeve. Of course I had. Ryan says we shouldn't book anything yet, she said. Okay. He thinks I need to figure out what I actually want before we spend $40,000 on a wedding. That sounds financially responsible. That's all you have? What do you want me to say? I don't know. She sat across from my work table. For the first time since I could remember, Brittany looked uncomfortable without trying to cover it with irritation. Mom hasn't talked to me much. I did not respond. I think she blames me for telling her to sign. Do you think she does? I know she does. How? She told me. That helps. Brittany looked annoyed. Thank you, detective. Trying to avoid mind reading. You've become exhausting. Become? That earned a tiny smile. Then she looked down at Grandma's card. I don't know what I'm good at if it isn't being Evelyn's granddaughter. The sentence surprised me. Not because it was false. Because Brittany said it without blaming me. I thought about telling her everything Rosa had said. How she understood brides. How she made people feel seen. How Grandma had noticed it. Then I stopped. I had spent too much of my life defining my sister, even when my definition was negative. She did not need another one from me. Then find out, I said. Brittany looked up. That's it? That's a pretty big assignment. She considered that. Then she nodded. We did not hug. She took the card and left. I think people sometimes expect reconciliation to arrive because the truth comes out. It does not. Truth only gives you accurate information about what needs rebuilding. The rebuilding still takes time. By the end of August, Brittany and I could speak without turning every sentence into childhood. That was progress. Patricia and I could not. After the hallway conversation, we went almost 3 months without speaking directly. She communicated through counsel when the license required it, and through Robert when she absolutely had to. I did not chase her. That surprised some relatives. Aunt Marlene called me once and said, "Your mother is hurting." I asked, "Does she want to talk to me?" Marlene paused. "She thinks you should call." Then no. She's still your mother, and I'm still her daughter. What does that mean? It means phones work in both directions. Marlene sighed, as if I had become intentionally difficult. Maybe I had. The difference was that difficulty no longer frightened me. Several relatives apologized for missing the wedding. Some apologized well. Megan did. She told me she had allowed fear about Aaron's job to make Patricia's framing feel inevitable. I should have asked whether there was another way, she said. I appreciated that. Others apologized by explaining themselves until I was expected to comfort them. I hope you understand why we did it. I thought the company was going under. Your mother made it sound like everyone's jobs depended on that night. To those people, I said the same thing. I appreciate you apologizing. I did not say it was okay. Because it was not. An apology can be accepted without restoring the access someone had before they needed to make it. That was another thing I learned. By late August, the first licensed production samples were finished. Rosa sent me photographs. The dogwood embroidery had been adapted onto a skirt panel with enough space around it to breathe. The production team had not tried to copy Grandma's drawing literally onto the gown. They had translated it. That was what good stewardship looked like. Not freezing work forever. Not pretending history could never be touched. Knowing when touching, it required permission and care. One Friday night, Adam made a dinner reservation at a small restaurant near the river. There was no occasion. Not our anniversary. That was still months away. No legal milestone. No family event. He said he wanted to have dinner with his wife somewhere that did not serve food beside a box of archive documents. Reasonable. I was getting dressed when I opened the drawer where Grandma's necklace had been sitting since Brittany returned it. I had received the formal estate handoff months earlier. Insurance completed. Chain of custody documented. Everything legal. Still, I had not worn it. Every time I looked at it, I saw Brittany beneath the Evelyn Legacy Collection sign. I saw the empty tables at my wedding. I saw the broken estate seal. I saw evidence. That night, for the first time, I saw the old floral clasp. The one Grandma had repaired when I was 16. I took the necklace out, fastened it around my neck, looked in the mirror. It did not transform me. It did not make me feel victorious. It did not erase anything. It just looked familiar. Adam walked into the bedroom and stopped. He knew immediately. You ready? I touched the clasp. For months, the necklace had felt like something my family stole, something I recovered, something lawyers photographed, something Brittany returned. I did not want it to spend the rest of my life meaning Patricia, or Brittany, or my wedding, or revenge. Grandma had owned it long before any of us turned it into evidence. I looked at Adam in the mirror. It finally feels like hers again. He smiled. Then we went to dinner. When I think about everything now, I do not think my biggest mistake was leaving Davis Bridal House years ago. Leaving was right. My mistake was assuming that because I had stopped fighting with my family, they understood where my boundaries were. They did not. People who benefit from ambiguity rarely rush to clarify it. I thought ownership documents were enough. I thought everyone knew the archive was mine. I thought everyone knew the necklace was mine. I thought everyone knew my wedding mattered. And when my family crossed those lines, I initially believed I had only two choices: accept it quietly or destroy everything they cared about. Neither was true. I could enforce the boundary. I could charge fairly for what belonged to me. I could protect innocent people without rescuing the person who caused the problem. I could acknowledge that Brittany had real strengths without pretending she had done nothing wrong. I could believe my father was sorry without giving him instant forgiveness. And I could let my mother keep the consequences she chose. Patricia had a way out. More than one. She could have asked before the party. She could have negotiated after the wedding. She could have signed the first license. She could have signed the second. Each time, she chose control instead. That was why I stopped feeling responsible for where she ended up. My family had counted on something they believed they knew about me. Lauren hates conflict. Lauren leaves. Lauren walks away. They were right about one part. I still walk away from arguments that exist only to exhaust me. I still do not scream until someone admits I am right. I still do not need every person in my family to agree with my decisions. But they had confused my refusal to fight endlessly with a willingness to surrender. That was their mistake. They had counted on me walking away. What they never understood was that walking away from them was not the same thing as walking away from what was mine. You do not have to destroy people to protect what belongs to you. Set clear boundaries, document agreements, and never let guilt pressure you into surrendering your rights. You can care about innocent people without rescuing those who created the problem. Real strength means choosing a fair solution and letting others face the consequences of their decisions. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to the channel for more drama.